Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the Olympic National Forest, deep in the wilderness near the Hoh River in Washington State, during what was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip with my co-workers. The idea had been Sarah Rodriguez's. She worked in our marketing department and was always pushing team-building activities that management actually approved of. "We need to get out of the city," she'd said during one of our lunch breaks, her dark eyes bright with enthusiasm. "Really disconnect, you know? No emails, no deadlines, just us and nature." Kevin King from IT had immediately volunteered. He was one of those outdoorsy types who owned more camping gear than furniture. Jennifer Williams from accounting had been hesitant at first, but Sarah's persistence won her over. That's how the four of us ended up driving Kevin's beaten-up Ford Explorer down Highway 101 on a Friday evening in late October, heading toward one of the most remote sections of the Olympic Peninsula. Kevin had picked the spot, a backcountry camping area near the Hoh River that required a 3-mile hike from the nearest Forest Service road. "It's perfect," he'd assured us, consulting his GPS and topographic maps. "Completely isolated. You can camp for days without seeing another soul." The drive took longer than expected. By the time we reached the unmarked dirt road that Kevin swore led to the trailhead, full darkness had settled over the forest like a suffocating blanket. The headlights carved narrow tunnels through the towering Douglas firs and western hemlocks, their massive trunks disappearing into the black void above. The silence outside was absolute. No traffic, no distant city sounds, just the occasional crack of a branch in the wind. "Are you sure this is right?" Jennifer asked from the back seat, her voice tight with anxiety. She'd been growing more nervous as we'd driven deeper into the wilderness, checking her phone obsessively even though we'd lost cell service miles ago. Kevin nodded confidently, though I noticed his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "Trust me, I've studied these maps for weeks. The trailhead should be just ahead." But when we reached what Kevin insisted was the right spot, there was no trailhead marker, no parking area, just a gap between the trees that might have been a trail or might have been a game path. Kevin checked his GPS, frowning at the blank screen. "That's weird," he muttered. "Battery was full when we left." Sarah leaned forward from the passenger seat. "Mine's dead too, completely drained." A chill that had nothing to do with the October air ran down my spine as I checked my own phone. Dead. All four of our devices had died simultaneously, despite being fully charged hours earlier. "It's probably just the cold," Kevin said, but his voice lacked conviction. "These electronics don't handle temperature drops well." We had no choice but to trust Kevin's navigation skills. He shouldered his massive backpack and led us into the darkness, our flashlight beams dancing across the narrow trail that wound between moss-covered boulders and fallen logs. The forest pressed in around us, dense and primordial, untouched by human presence. Every step took us deeper into a world that felt increasingly hostile to our existence. The hiking was harder than any of us had anticipated. What Kevin had described as a gentle 3-mile nature walk became a grueling climb over deadfall and through dense undergrowth that seemed to grab at our clothes and gear. Jennifer struggled the most. She'd packed heavy despite our advice, and her cheap hiking boots weren't meant for this terrain. "How much further?" she gasped after we'd been walking for what felt like hours. Kevin consulted his compass, squinting at the glowing dial. "Should be just over this ridge." But we crossed 3 ridges before we finally found the camping spot Kevin had marked on his maps. It was a small clearing beside what sounded like the Hoh River, though we couldn't see the water in the darkness. The space was barely large enough for our 2 tents, surrounded by towering trees that blocked out even the faintest starlight. "This is it?" Sarah asked, unable to hide her disappointment. "It'll look better in the morning," Kevin said, already unpacking his gear with practiced efficiency. Trust me, the sunrise over the river is going to be incredible. We set up camp by flashlight, working in pairs to pitch the tents and organize our supplies. Kevin and I shared the larger tent while Sarah and Jennifer took the smaller one. The temperature was dropping fast and our breath came out in visible puffs as we worked. "I can't get this stupid thing to light," Sarah muttered, kneeling beside the fire ring Kevin had built. She'd been trying to start a fire for 20 minutes, but the kindling wouldn't catch despite being bone dry. Kevin took over, using the expensive fire-starting kit he'd bought specifically for this trip, but even his efforts failed. The wood would smoke and smolder but refused to produce actual flames, as if the forest itself was determined to keep us cold and in the dark. "Forget it," I said finally. "We'll just use our sleeping bags. They're rated for much colder than this." But as we sat in the darkness, eating cold sandwiches and trying to ignore the oppressive atmosphere, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with this place. The silence was too complete. No insects chirping, no small animals rustling in the undergrowth, not even the sound of the river we could hear earlier. It was as if every living thing in the forest had fled, leaving only us in the suffocating quiet. "Did you guys hear that?" Jennifer whispered suddenly. We all froze, listening. At first, there was nothing but the familiar silence. Then, just at the edge of hearing came a sound that made my skin crawl. A low, rhythmic chanting in a language I didn't recognize, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. "It's just the wind," Kevin said, but his hand moved instinctively to the hunting knife on his belt. The chanting faded after a few minutes, but none of us felt like sleeping. We huddled together in the darkness, flashlights forming a small circle of weak light that seemed pathetically inadequate against the vast blackness surrounding us. "Maybe we should head back to the car," Jennifer suggested. "Come back in the morning when we can actually see where we're going." "No way," Kevin said firmly. "We hiked 3 miles to get here. I'm not giving up now because of some weird acoustics." Sarah nodded in agreement, though I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. "Kevin's right. We're here to disconnect and challenge ourselves. Besides, it's probably just as dangerous hiking back in the dark." Eventually, exhaustion won out over anxiety. We retreated to our respective tents, though I noticed everyone kept their flashlights within easy reach. Inside our tent, Kevin fell asleep almost immediately, his steady breathing the only sound in the unnatural silence. But I lay awake for hours, listening to the nothing that pressed against the thin nylon walls like a living thing. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, I was awakened by movement outside our tent. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling our campsite. I reached for my flashlight but found my hand shaking too badly to operate the switch. The footsteps stopped directly outside our tent wall, close enough that I should have been able to hear breathing, but there was only that terrible silence. "Kevin," I whispered, but my tentmate didn't stir. The presence lingered for what felt like an eternity before moving away. I heard similar sounds outside the girl's tent, the same slow, deliberate circling. Then nothing. When I finally managed to fall asleep, my dreams were filled with dark shapes moving between the trees and voices speaking in that same incomprehensible language I'd heard earlier. Dawn came gray and filtered, the weak sunlight barely penetrating the forest canopy. I emerged from the tent feeling exhausted and disoriented, as if I hadn't slept at all. The campsite looked different in the daylight, smaller, more exposed, surrounded by trees that seemed to lean inward like curious observers. Sarah was already up, sitting on a fallen log and staring into the cold ashes of our failed fire. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled, and dark circles ringed her eyes. "Did you sleep at all?" I asked. She shook her head. "Something was walking around our tent all night. Jennifer thinks I was dreaming, but I know what I heard." Kevin emerged from our tent looking surprisingly refreshed, as if he'd had the best night's sleep of his life. "Morning, sunshine," he called out cheerfully. "Ready for a day of hiking?" His enthusiasm felt forced, almost manic, and there was something different about his smile. Too wide, lasting too long. When Jennifer joined us a few minutes later, she immediately noticed it too. "Are you feeling okay, Kevin?" she asked. "You look, I don't know, weird." Kevin's smile never wavered. "Never better. In fact, I think I'll gather some firewood so we can have a proper breakfast. There's a great spot about a quarter-mile upstream where the river bends." Before any of us could object, he grabbed his hatchet and disappeared into the forest, moving with a strange, fluid grace that seemed completely unlike his usual awkward gait. "He's acting really strange," Jennifer murmured once he was out of earshot. Sarah nodded grimly. "Something happened to him last night. I can feel it." We waited for Kevin to return, growing more anxious with each passing minute. An hour passed, then 2. I called his name repeatedly, my voice echoing strangely in the dense forest, but there was no response. "We need to look for him," I said finally. We followed the direction Kevin had taken, staying close together as we pushed through the undergrowth. The forest felt different during the day, not less threatening, but threatening in a different way. Every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes, and the trees themselves appeared to shift and move when I wasn't looking directly at them. We found Kevin's hatchet embedded in a massive cedar tree, the blade sunk deep into the bark as if it had been thrown with inhuman force. But there was no sign of Kevin himself, just scuffed earth around the base of the tree and what looked like drag marks leading deeper into the forest. "Kevin!" Sarah shouted, her voice cracking with fear. "Kevin, where are you?" The forest swallowed her words without even an echo. We searched for another hour before Jennifer broke down completely. "He's gone," she sobbed. "Something took him. We need to get out of here and call for help." But as we started back toward camp, we heard Kevin's voice calling from ahead of us, cheerful, untroubled, as if nothing had happened. "Hey guys, where did you go? I've been waiting at camp with firewood." We found him sitting beside a perfectly arranged pile of dry kindling, his clothes clean and his hiking boots free of mud, despite the fact that the forest floor was soaked from the previous night's dew. He smiled that same too wide smile when he saw us. "Where were you?" Sarah demanded. "We've been looking for you for hours. We found your hatchet stuck in a tree." Kevin looked genuinely puzzled. "My hatchet? It's right here." He gestured to the tool hanging from his belt, the same hatchet we'd left embedded in the cedar tree. "That's impossible," I said. "We just saw it." "I think you guys need some food," Kevin interrupted, his smile never faltering. "Low blood sugar can cause hallucinations, you know." He started a fire with impossible ease, the wood catching immediately despite having refused to burn the night before. The flames were wrong somehow. Too blue, too cold, casting shadows that moved independently of their source. As Kevin prepared breakfast with mechanical precision, I noticed other things that weren't quite right. He moved differently, with a fluid, predatory grace that reminded me of a stalking cat. His blink rate was too slow, his eyes staying open for uncomfortably long periods before the lids finally descended. And he had forgotten things. Basic facts about our workplace, shared memories from our years of working together. "Remember when Jim from sales got drunk at the Christmas party and tried to photocopy his face?" Sarah asked, testing him. Kevin's smile flickered for just a moment. "Of course. Good old Jim. That was funny." But Jim had quit 6 months ago, and the incident Sarah described had happened to someone else entirely. Jennifer caught my eye and mouthed silently, "Not Kevin." We ate in tense silence, pretending everything was normal while Kevin chattered about hiking trails and wildlife in a voice that sounded like Kevin's but with subtle wrong inflections, like someone learning to speak English from a textbook. "I think we should pack up and head back early," I said carefully. "Jennifer's not feeling well." "Nonsense!" Kevin's response was too loud, too enthusiastic. "We just got here. Besides, I found something really interesting upstream. You have to see it." "What kind of something?" Sarah asked. Kevin's eyes glittered with an emotion I couldn't identify. "It's hard to describe. You'll understand when you see it. Trust me." Every instinct I had screamed against following him anywhere, but I couldn't think of a way to refuse without making it obvious that we suspected something was wrong. We broke camp slowly, packing our gear while Kevin watched with that unblinking stare. The trail Kevin led us on didn't exist on any of his maps. It wound deeper into the forest, following animal paths and deer trails that seemed to appear and disappear at random. The trees grew larger and more twisted as we walked, their bark scarred with symbols that looked almost like writing in an alien alphabet. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Jennifer asked, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Oh, yes," Kevin said without turning around. "Very sure. We're almost there." The forest around us began to change in subtle ways. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe. The light filtering through the canopy took on a greenish tint that made everything look diseased. And the silence, that unnatural, absolute silence, grew more oppressive with each step. We walked for what felt like hours, but could have been minutes. Time seemed elastic in this place, stretching and contracting in ways that made my head spin. My watch had stopped working, its hands frozen at 3:17, though I couldn't remember when I'd last checked it. Finally, Kevin stopped in a clearing dominated by a massive stone formation, a natural arch that seemed to pulse with its own internal light. The rock was covered in the same strange symbols we'd seen carved into the trees, but these looked fresh, as if they'd been cut recently. "Isn't it beautiful?" Kevin asked, his voice filled with genuine reverence. The arch made my stomach churn just looking at it. There was something fundamentally wrong with its geometry, as if it existed in more dimensions than my eyes could process. The space beneath it seemed darker than mere shadow, a void that suggested infinite depth. "It's interesting," Sarah managed, her face pale. "Oh, it's much more than that," Kevin said, and when he turned to face us, his smile revealed teeth that were too sharp, too many. "It's a doorway." That's when Jennifer ran. She bolted back down the trail, crashing through the undergrowth with Kevin, or the thing wearing Kevin's face, in pursuit. His movements were no longer remotely human, flowing like liquid shadow as he gave chase. Sarah and I followed, but we were too slow, too clumsy compared to the predator hunting our friend. We found Jennifer 20 yards from the clearing, crouched behind a fallen log with Kevin standing over her. But this Kevin was different. Taller, his limbs too long, his skin gray and mottled like tree bark. His face was still recognizably Kevin's, but stretched and distorted, like a photograph that had been manipulated. "Don't be afraid," he said in Kevin's voice, though it echoed strangely as if coming from a great distance. "This will only hurt for a moment." Jennifer screamed as Kevin's 2 long fingers wrapped around her throat. The sound was cut off abruptly, replaced by a wet, tearing noise that I will never be able to forget. Blood sprayed across the mossy ground as the thing that had been Kevin opened Jennifer's throat with claws that extended from what had once been human fingernails. Sarah grabbed my arm, her grip painfully tight. "Run," she whispered. We ran. Behind us, Kevin's laughter followed. The sound distorted and multiplied until it seemed to come from every tree, every shadow. The forest itself was laughing at our terror, delighting in our desperation. We crashed through the undergrowth, branches tearing at our clothes and skin, our breathing ragged with panic and exertion. The trail, if it had ever existed, was gone. Every direction looked the same, endless trees disappearing into green-tinged darkness. "Which way?" Sarah gasped, blood running from a cut on her cheek. I tried to remember the route we'd taken, but the forest seemed to have rearranged itself around us. Nothing looked familiar. Every tree, every rock formation, every fallen log was alien, as if we'd stumbled into a completely different world. Kevin's voice drifted through the trees, sometimes near, sometimes distant, always wrong. He was calling our names in that cheerful, friendly tone, as if this was all an elaborate game of hide-and-seek. Come out, he sang. "I have something wonderful to show you." We kept moving, driven by pure terror, until we stumbled into another clearing. This one contained the ruins of what might have been a cabin, its walls collapsed and overgrown with moss and vines. In the center of the ruins stood a stone fireplace, still intact, with fresh ashes in the hearth. "Someone was here recently," Sarah whispered, kneeling beside the fireplace. But the ashes were wrong. Too white, too fine, like powdered bone, and mixed among them were fragments that looked disturbingly like teeth and small bones. A shadow fell across the clearing as Kevin emerged from the tree line. He looked almost normal again, except for his eyes, black from lid to lid, reflecting light like an animal's. "Found you," he said pleasantly. Sarah threw a handful of the bone ash in his face, and Kevin recoiled with a shriek that was definitely not human. His skin blistered where the ash touched it, and for a moment his true form showed through, something with too many joints and skin like wet leather. "Iron," Sarah said grimly, pulling a camping knife from her belt. "Cold iron." She lunged at Kevin with the blade, and when it connected, he screamed again, a sound like tearing metal that made my ears ring. Dark fluid poured from the wound, steaming where it hit the ground. Kevin staggered backward, his face shifting between human and something else. "You can't kill me," he snarled. "I am older than your species, older than your fears." "Maybe not," I said, grabbing a heavy piece of iron from the ruined cabin, part of an old wood stove, "but we can hurt you." I brought the iron down on Kevin's skull with all my strength. The impact sent shockwaves up my arms, and Kevin crumpled to the ground, his form flickering between human and monster before settling into something that was neither. "Is he dead?" Sarah whispered. The thing on the ground twitched, and one black eye opened to stare at us with infinite malice. "Not dead," it hissed. "Never dead. But hurt. You have bought yourselves time." We didn't wait to hear more. Sarah and I ran from the clearing, the monster's labored breathing echoing behind us. This time, we had a direction, away from the stone arch, away from the wrongness that seemed to emanate from that cursed place. The forest fought us every step of the way. Branches grabbed at our clothes like grasping fingers. Roots rose up to trip us. The very air seemed to thicken, making each breath a struggle. But we kept moving, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant death, or worse. I don't know how long we stumbled through that nightmare landscape. Time had no meaning in that place between worlds. But eventually, we saw something impossible. Electric lights through the trees. The Forest Service road materialized around us like a mirage, Kevin's Explorer sitting exactly where we'd left it, though I would have sworn we'd traveled miles from this spot. The keys were still in the ignition and the engine started on the first try. We drove in absolute silence until we reached the main highway, neither of us daring to speak of what we'd experienced. It was only when we saw the lights of Port Angeles ahead that Sarah finally broke down, sobbing with relief and trauma. "What was that thing?" she whispered. I thought about the legends I'd heard, the stories indigenous peoples told about creatures that could take human form, that fed on fear and flesh and souls. "Something old," I said finally. "Something that should have stayed buried." We never reported what happened. Who would have believed us? Instead, we told the authorities that Kevin and Jennifer had decided to extend their camping trip, that we'd left them at their request. When their bodies were eventually found weeks later, what was left of them, the official cause of death was listed as animal attack, but I know better. I know that something ancient and hungry still stalks the deep forests of the Olympic Peninsula, wearing human faces and calling out in familiar voices. I know that some doors, once opened, can never be completely closed. And sometimes in the darkest hours before dawn, I hear Kevin's voice calling my name from the shadows outside my apartment, asking me to come out and play. I've never gone camping again. My name is Daniel Lopez, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of the Olympic National Forest in Washington, near a place called the Quinault River Valley, where the ancient cedars grow so thick that daylight barely reaches the forest floor even at noon. I should have listened to the park ranger at the Quinault Ranger Station. When I told him our group planned to hike the unmaintained trail to Enchanted Valley and then push deeper into the backcountry toward the abandoned logging camp near Lake Cushman, his weathered face went pale. "That area's been closed to camping for good reason," he said, his fingers drumming nervously on the counter. "Strange things happen up there. Folks go missing." But I was young and cocky, fresh out of college with my forestry degree, convinced that my education made me smarter than some old-timer spouting local superstitions. My 3 best friends, Marcus Williams, Ashley Robinson, and Jennifer Williams, trusted my judgment completely. We'd been hiking together since high school, and I'd never led them astray before. Marcus was our group's comedian, always cracking jokes to lighten the mood, his infectious laugh echoing through whatever wilderness we explored. He worked as a mechanic and had hands that could fix anything, which made him invaluable on our trips. Ashley was the practical one, a nurse who packed the most thorough first aid kit you've ever seen and could identify edible plants better than most botanists. Jennifer, Ashley's younger sister, was our photographer, constantly capturing the beauty of the places we visited with an expensive camera that she'd saved for 2 years to buy. The plan was simple: 4 days, 3 nights, deep in the untouched wilderness where cell towers couldn't reach, and the nearest road was a 2-day hike away. We wanted to disconnect completely, to find that primal peace that only exists in places humans have barely touched. The first day went perfectly. We parked at the trailhead near Quinault Lake at dawn, shouldered our packs, and headed into the misty forest. The trail was well maintained for the first 8 miles, winding through groves of massive Sitka spruce and Douglas fir that must have been growing when Lewis and Clark first explored this region. Jennifer stopped constantly to photograph the cathedral-like spaces between the enormous trunks, where shafts of golden sunlight slanted through the canopy like divine benediction. "This place feels ancient," Ashley whispered as we paused for lunch beside a creek that tumbled over moss-covered rocks. "Like we're the first people to ever see it." Marcus grinned, unwrapping a sandwich. "Daniel's finally found us the perfect spot. No crowds, no tour buses, no kids throwing rocks in the water." I felt proud hearing that. Finding pristine wilderness was becoming harder every year, and I'd spent months researching this particular route. The topographic maps showed an old logging road that had been reclaimed by the forest, leading to a series of remote campsites that hadn't been officially maintained since the 1980s. We made good time that first day, covering 12 miles before setting up camp in a small meadow surrounded by towering pines. The silence was absolute, except for the distant murmur of water over stones and the occasional call of a loon from somewhere in the darkening forest. We built a fire, cooked dinner, and sat around the flames telling stories until the stars emerged in brilliant profusion overhead. "Look at that," Jennifer breathed, pointing her camera skyward. "You can actually see the Milky Way." "No, light pollution," I explained, settling into my sleeping bag. "This is what the night sky looked like to people for thousands of years before we invented cities." But lying there in the profound darkness after our fire died to embers, I felt something I'd never experienced in all my years of wilderness camping, a creeping unease that seemed to seep from the forest itself. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was expectant, as if the trees were holding their breath, waiting for something. I told myself it was just the unfamiliar environment. We were deeper in the wilderness than we'd ever been before, farther from help than I'd ever ventured. But throughout that first night, I kept hearing sounds that didn't quite fit. The snap of a branch when there was no wind, footsteps that stopped whenever I lifted my head to listen, and once, around 3 in the morning, what sounded distinctly like someone whispering my name. The second day dawned gray and oppressive, with low clouds hanging like smoke between the trees. We broke camp and continued deeper into the forest, following game trails and my compass toward the coordinates I'd marked on my GPS for the old logging camp. The device had been acting strange since we'd entered the deep forest. the screen flickering occasionally, the satellite signal weaker than it should have been under open sky. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" Ashley asked around noon when we stopped to rest beside a stream that definitely wasn't marked on any of my maps. I checked the GPS again, frowning at the display. According to the device, we were somehow 3 miles south of where we should have been, despite following a straight bearing all morning. "The terrain must be interfering with the signal," I said, though I didn't really believe it. "We'll adjust course and compensate." Marcus laughed, but it sounded forced. "Good thing Daniel's our navigator. I can barely read a road map, let alone figure out where we are in the middle of nowhere." Jennifer had been unusually quiet all morning, frequently stopping to look back the way we'd come. When I asked if she was okay, she shook her head as if clearing it. "I keep feeling like someone's following us," she said, "but every time I turn around, there's nothing there." "It's the trees," Ashley said, though her voice lacked conviction. "They're so thick here, and with this mist, it creates shadows that look like movement." But I'd noticed it too, that persistent sense of being watched, of eyes tracking our progress through the forest. Several times I'd caught glimpses of something pale moving between the distant trees, always at the edge of my vision, always gone when I turned to look directly. We found the logging camp late that afternoon, though it wasn't anything like what I'd expected from the historical photos I'd researched. The buildings had been completely reclaimed by the forest, reduced to mossy foundation stones and the rusted skeletal remains of heavy machinery. But there was something disturbing about the place, a wrongness that made my skin crawl. The trees around the camp were different from the rest of the forest. Where everything else was lush and green, these pines were sickly and sparse, their needles yellowed and dropping despite the season. Many showed deep gashes in their bark, as if something with enormous claws had been sharpening them on the trunks. "What could have done this?" Ashley asked, running her fingers along one of the deep grooves. The marks were at least 8 feet off the ground and looked fresh despite the camp's decades of abandonment. "Bear, maybe?" Marcus suggested, but his voice was uncertain. "Though I've never seen claw marks that big." Jennifer was photographing the damaged trees when she suddenly stopped, her camera lowering slowly. "Daniel," she said, her voice tight with fear. "Look at this." She was pointing at a tree about 20 feet away. Carved into the bark, crude but unmistakable, were symbols that definitely weren't natural. They formed a rough circle around the trunk, and within that circle were shapes that hurt to look at directly. Angular, impossible geometries that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking straight at them. "Probably just old Native American markings," I said, though I knew that wasn't right. The cuts were too fresh, and there was something fundamentally wrong about the symbols that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on them. We set up camp in the least disturbing part of the old logging site, near what had once been the main road. Our fire seemed smaller that night, the flames weaker, and the darkness beyond its circle felt dense and malevolent. We tried to maintain our usual camping routine: dinner, stories, stargazing. But conversation kept dying into uncomfortable silences. It was Marcus who first noticed that our supplies were wrong. "Hey, did anyone eat my trail mix?" he asked, rummaging through his pack. "I know I packed 2 bags, but there's only one here." Ashley checked her pack and frowned. "My extra batteries are missing. I specifically remember putting them in the side pocket." A systematic inventory revealed that small items had disappeared from all our packs. Food, equipment, personal belongings. Things that couldn't have simply fallen out or been forgotten. The thefts were deliberate and methodical, but that was impossible. We'd been together all day, and who else could be out here in this remote wilderness? "Maybe animals got into our packs while we were exploring the camp," Jennifer suggested. But we all knew that didn't explain missing batteries and sealed food packages that had vanished without leaving any torn packaging behind. Sleep came hard that second night. Every sound from the forest seemed amplified and threatening. The rustle of branches, the distant cry of night birds, and periodically footsteps circling our camp just beyond the firelight. I lay in my sleeping bag staring at the tent ceiling, listening to something moving through the trees with a patient, predatory rhythm. Around 2 in the morning, Jennifer started screaming. We all bolted upright to find her thrashing in her sleeping bag, eyes wide with terror, pointing at the tent wall. "There's someone outside," she sobbed. "Someone was watching us through the fabric." Marcus grabbed his flashlight and unzipped the tent door, sweeping the beam across the campsite. The light revealed nothing but trees and shadows, but in the soft earth around our tent were footprints. Large, bare human feet with impossibly long toes that ended in what looked like claws. "We need to leave," Ashley said, her nurse's training keeping her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "First thing in the morning, we pack up and head straight back to the trailhead." I wanted to agree, but when I checked my GPS, the device showed nothing but static. The compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. Our maps, which had been perfectly clear the day before, now seemed to show terrain that didn't match anything around us. "The gear must be malfunctioning," I said, though the words felt hollow. "Some kind of magnetic anomaly in the area." Marcus laughed bitterly. "Right. A magnetic anomaly that steals our food and leaves monster footprints around our tent." None of us slept for the rest of that night. We sat in a tight circle around our dying fire, taking turns feeding it branches and watching the tree line for movement. As dawn finally began to lighten the sky, something white flitted between the trees about 50 yards from our camp, there for a moment, then gone. The third day was when everything went truly wrong. We broke camp as soon as there was enough light to see, desperate to get away from the cursed logging site, but within an hour of hiking it became clear that we were lost. The trails we'd followed to reach the camp had vanished, and the GPS showed our position as completely blank. Not even an error message, just empty white screen. "This is impossible," I muttered, staring at the useless device. GPS satellites cover the entire planet. There's nowhere on Earth where you get no signal at all. Ashley had been studying our paper maps with a magnifying glass from her first aid kit. "Daniel," she said slowly, "these aren't the same maps we brought." She was right. The topographic maps that had guided us into the forest now showed different terrain entirely. Mountains where there should have been valleys, rivers flowing in impossible directions, and vast blank areas marked only with warnings in a language I didn't recognize. "Someone switched our maps," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. When could someone have done it? We'd been together constantly, and the maps had been in my pack the entire time. Jennifer had been taking pictures all morning, documenting our attempts to navigate, when she suddenly stopped walking. "Guys," she said, her voice strange and flat, "I need to go get some firewood." "What?" Ashley looked confused. "We're trying to find our way out of here. We don't need firewood." But Jennifer was already walking away from our group, moving toward a dense stand of pines with that odd mechanical gait. "I need to go get some firewood," she repeated in exactly the same tone, as if she were a recording playing back. "Jen, wait," I called, but she continued walking without acknowledging us, disappearing into the trees. We called her name for 10 minutes before Marcus suggested we follow her trail. Her footprints were easy to spot in the soft forest floor, but they led us in a winding path that seemed to double back on itself multiple times. At one point, we found a tree where she'd apparently stopped and stood for a long time. The ground around it was scuffed as if she'd been pacing in tight circles. We found her an hour later, standing motionless in a small clearing, her back to us. She was holding an armload of dead branches, but she wasn't moving or responding to our calls. "Jennifer?" Ashley approached cautiously. "Are you okay?" When Jennifer finally turned around, my blood turned to ice. Her face was completely blank, eyes unfocused and staring at something beyond us. Her mouth was slightly open, and there was a thin line of drool running down her chin. But worse than that was her smile, a wide, empty grin that showed too many teeth. "I got the firewood," she said in that same flat, mechanical voice. Then she laughed, but it wasn't Jennifer's laugh. It was something pretending to be Jennifer's laugh, getting the pitch and rhythm slightly wrong. Ashley reached out to touch her sister's forehead. "Jen, you're scaring us. Are you feeling sick?" Jennifer's head tilted at an unnatural angle like a bird studying prey. "I'm fine," she said, but the words came out too fast, as if she were eager to get them over with. "I feel perfect. Everything is perfect." The firewood fell from her arms as she spoke, and I saw that the branches were all wrong, twisted and black, covered in the same diseased bark we'd seen around the logging camp. Some of the pieces looked less like wood and more like bones. "We need to get back to camp," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Come on, Jen, let's go." She followed us. But something was fundamentally wrong with the way she moved. Her gait was too stiff, her head turning to track sounds that none of us could hear. Occasionally, she would stop walking entirely and stand frozen for several seconds before suddenly lurching back into motion. When we made camp that night, our third in the cursed forest, Jennifer sat slightly apart from the rest of us, staring into the fire with that empty smile. She ate her dinner methodically, chewing each bite exactly 20 times before swallowing, but I never saw her blink. "Jen," Ashley said gently, "do you remember taking those pictures this morning?" Jennifer's head swiveled toward her sister with mechanical precision. "Pictures?" she repeated. "Yes, I take pictures." But when Ashley asked to see the camera, Jennifer clutched it protectively against her chest and shook her head violently. Marcus pulled me aside while Ashley tried to talk to her sister. "That's not Jennifer," he whispered. "I don't know what happened to her in those woods, but that thing isn't our friend." I wanted to deny it, to find some rational explanation for Jennifer's behavior. Heat exhaustion, maybe, or some kind of psychological break from the stress of being lost. But deep down, I knew Marcus was right. Whatever had come back with us from that clearing, it wasn't Jennifer Williams. As the fire died down that night, I caught Ashley crying silently in her sleeping bag. When I asked what was wrong, she showed me Jennifer's camera. The LCD screen was cracked, but I could still see the last photo Jennifer had taken, a picture of herself in the clearing where we'd found her, but her eyes in the photo were completely black, and standing behind her, barely visible in the shadows, was something tall and pale with too many joints in its arms. "Look at the timestamp," Ashley whispered. The photo had been taken 6 hours before we'd found Jennifer in the clearing, which meant she'd been standing in that spot, motionless, from before dawn until we'd discovered her in the afternoon. I didn't sleep at all that third night. None of us did. We sat around the dying fire watching Jennifer, who sat perfectly still, never changing position, never blinking, that horrible empty smile never wavering. Occasionally, she would whisper something under her breath, words in a language that sounded like grinding stone and breaking glass. Around 3 in the morning, she suddenly stood up and walked to the edge of our camp. "Someone's coming," she announced in that flat, mechanical voice. "They want to meet us." I strained my ears but heard nothing except the usual forest sounds. "There's no one out there, Jen." Her head turned toward me with that unnatural, bird-like motion. "They've been waiting so long," she said. "They're so hungry." That's when we heard it. Footsteps in the forest, moving with the same patient, predatory rhythm we'd heard every night. But this time, there were multiple sets of feet, and they were definitely approaching our camp. Marcus grabbed a burning branch from the fire, holding it like a torch. "Show yourself," he shouted into the darkness. "What do you want?" The footsteps stopped, and for a moment the forest was absolutely silent. Then Jennifer started laughing, that wrong, inhuman laugh that sounded like wind through a broken window. "They want to play," she said. "They want to show us their games." The first one emerged from the tree line across from where Jennifer was standing. In the flickering firelight, it looked almost human, tall and gaunt, with pale skin that seemed to glow slightly in the darkness. But its proportions were wrong, arms too long and fingers that ended in black claws. Its face was the worst part. Human features stretched and distorted, with a mouth full of teeth like broken glass and eyes that reflected the firelight like an animal's. "Wendigo," I breathed, remembering the old stories from my forestry classes. The cannibal spirit of indigenous folklore, a human transformed by consuming human flesh in the wilderness. But this wasn't folklore. This was real, and it was looking directly at me with those horrible reflective eyes. More shapes emerged from the forest. 3, 4, then too many to count. They moved with that same unnatural gait, like predators who had learned to imitate human movement but couldn't quite get it right. Some were more transformed than others, barely recognizable as having once been human. Jennifer walked toward them with her arms outstretched, like she was greeting old friends. "They've been so lonely," she said, "and so hungry, but now they have us." One of the creatures reached out and touched Jennifer's face with its clawed hand, almost gently. Where it touched her, her skin began to change, taking on that same pale, luminescent quality. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Ashley's hand and pulling her away from the fire. "Run, now!" We crashed through the forest in blind panic, leaving everything behind except the clothes on our backs. Behind us, I could hear Jennifer's laughter echoing through the trees, but it was changing, becoming something inhuman and predatory. The sound of pursuit followed us, not just footsteps now, but voices calling our names in tones that were almost right but subtly wrong, like recordings being played back at the wrong speed. Ashley stumbled and fell, crying out in pain as her ankle twisted. I helped her up, but she could barely put weight on the injured foot. "Leave me," she gasped. "You have to get help." "Never," I said, pulling her arm around my shoulders. "We stick together." Marcus was behind us, still carrying the burning branch, but the flame was dying and would soon leave us in complete darkness. "This way," he shouted, pointing toward what looked like a gap in the trees. We stumbled through the forest for what felt like hours, Ashley leaning heavily on me, all of us gasping for breath. The sounds of pursuit seemed to come from all directions now, voices in the darkness calling our names, footsteps that sometimes sounded close and sometimes distant. Finally, we found a small cave, little more than a depression in a rocky outcrop, but it was shelter. We crawled inside and huddled together while Marcus used the last of his matches to light small fires with twigs and dry leaves. "What were those things?" Ashley sobbed, cradling her injured ankle. "Wendigos," I said, though the word felt inadequate to describe what we'd witnessed. According to legend, they're humans who turn to cannibalism in the wilderness. It transforms them into something else. Marcus stared at the cave entrance, gripping a sharp rock like a weapon. "And Jennifer?" I couldn't answer that. What had happened to Jennifer was beyond my understanding, some kind of possession or transformation that had begun the moment she'd wandered off to collect firewood. Maybe she'd encountered the creatures earlier and been changed by them, or maybe something worse had happened in that clearing where we'd found her. We spent the rest of the night in that cave, taking turns keeping watch while the others tried to rest. Every sound from outside made us freeze, the snap of a branch, the whisper of wind through leaves, and once, just before dawn, the sound of Jennifer's voice calling our names from somewhere very close. "Ashley," she called in that flat, mechanical tone. "Daniel, Marcus, come out and play. The games are just beginning." Ashley started to respond, but I clamped my hand over her mouth. Whatever was calling to us wasn't Jennifer anymore, and I had a terrible feeling that if we answered, we'd end up like her, changed into something hungry and pale that hunted through the forest looking for new victims. As the sun finally rose, the voices faded and the forest grew quiet. We waited until full daylight before leaving the cave, and then we started walking in what we hoped was the direction of the trailhead. Without our GPS or reliable maps, we had to navigate by the sun and hope for the best. It took us 2 more days to find our way out of that cursed forest. 2 days of hiking on Ashley's injured ankle, of jumping at every sound, of constant fear that the creatures would find us during the day. We rationed our remaining water and ate berries when we could find them, but mostly we just walked, driven by the desperate need to reach civilization. When we finally stumbled onto the maintained trail near Kino Lake, I fell to my knees and cried with relief. We were dirty, exhausted, and traumatized, but we were alive. Ashley's ankle had swollen to twice its normal size, and Marcus had developed a fever from infected scratches, but we'd made it out. The park rangers found us on the trail an hour later. Apparently, our rental car had been sitting in the parking lot for 5 days, and they'd been preparing to send out a search party. They took us to the hospital in Aberdeen, where we were treated for dehydration, exhaustion, and various injuries. But when we tried to tell them what had happened, about the creatures and Jennifer's transformation, they just exchanged glances and asked if we'd consumed any wild mushrooms or unfamiliar plants. The official report listed Jennifer Williams as missing, presumed lost in the wilderness, despite our insistence that she'd been taken by something unnatural. They sent search teams into the Olympic National Forest, but they never found any trace of Jennifer or the logging camp where we'd encountered the creatures. The GPS coordinates I'd marked led to nothing but dense forest with no sign of human habitation, past or present. It's been 3 months since we escaped from that forest, and I still wake up screaming most nights. Ashley moved back in with her parents and hasn't left the house since we got back. Marcus quit his job and started drinking heavily, claiming he can still hear Jennifer's voice calling his name in the dark. I've researched everything I can find about Wendigos and similar creatures, reading academic papers on folklore and indigenous legends. Most sources agree that Wendigos are created by cannibalism in the wilderness. Humans who consume human flesh and are transformed into something else, something that can never be satisfied no matter how much it feeds. But there are other stories too, darker ones about entire groups of humans who disappeared into remote wilderness areas and emerged changed, no longer quite human, but not fully monster either. They're said to live in the deep places of the world, the forests and mountains that humanity has never fully tamed, calling to hikers and campers and promising them secrets that no human mind was meant to know. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear Jennifer's voice outside my apartment window. Not her real voice, but that flat, mechanical imitation that wore her face in the forest. She's calling my name, promising that if I come back to the woods, she'll show me such wonderful things. I've changed my phone number twice, moved to a different city, and started seeing a therapist who specializes in trauma. But I know it's only a matter of time before the hunger calls me back to the wilderness. The same hunger that took Jennifer is growing inside me now, whispering that there are answers in the deep forest, if I'm brave enough to seek them. The rational part of my mind knows that survival depends on staying in civilization, on avoiding the wild places where things like Wendigos hunt. But every day the call grows stronger, and every night I dream of pale figures moving through moonlit trees, their reflective eyes full of ancient patience. I'm writing this down as a warning, though I doubt anyone will believe it. If you're planning to hike in the deep wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, especially in areas that aren't regularly maintained or patrolled, please reconsider. And if you do go, never wander off alone to collect firewood, because sometimes when you go looking for wood in the forest, something else finds you first. And what comes back might look like you, might even think it is you, but it will be hungry for things that human beings were never meant to taste. The hunger is calling to me now as I write these final words. I can hear Jennifer's voice on the wind, promising that the games are just beginning. I think I'm going to answer her call. I think I'm going to go collect some firewood. My name is Robert Johnson, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the Olympic National Forest, deep in the Quinault River Valley of Washington State, where the ancient cedars grow so thick that daylight barely reaches the forest floor even at noon. Michael Williams and I had been planning this backpacking trip for months. We'd been friends since college, bonded over late-night study sessions and a shared love of the outdoors. Mike was the kind of guy who could make you laugh even when you were miserable, always cracking jokes, always seeing the bright side. He was shorter than me, stocky with calloused hands from his job as a carpenter, and had this infectious grin that made strangers want to buy him drinks. The plan was simple. 3 days hiking the remote backcountry trails near Lake Quinault, away from the tourist crowds, just two friends reconnecting with nature and each other. We'd both been going through rough patches. My divorce had just been finalized, and Mike had been laid off from his construction job. This trip was supposed to be therapeutic, a chance to clear our heads and remember what really mattered. I should have known something was wrong from the moment we reached the trailhead. The ranger station at Quinault was supposed to be open, but when we arrived at dawn, it sat empty with a hastily scrawled sign reading, "Closed, Emergency." Mike laughed it off, saying we'd just register when we got back. The parking lot, usually busy even in early season, was completely deserted except for one rusted pickup truck that looked like it had been there for years. "Weird," I muttered, shouldering my pack. "I've never seen it this quiet." "Better for us," Mike said cheerfully, adjusting his own gear. "No crowds, no noise, just you, me, and Mother Nature." The trail started normal enough. We followed the Quinault River upstream, the water rushing brown and wild from recent rains. The forest here was old growth, with Douglas firs and red cedars that had been standing when Lewis and Clark first mapped the territory. Moss hung from every branch like tattered funeral shrouds, and the air smelled of decomposition and new growth all mingled together. For the first few hours, everything felt right. Mike kept up his usual stream of commentary, pointing out interesting plants, making fun of my new hiking boots, telling stories about his latest dating disasters. But as we climbed higher into the mountains, away from any marked trails, something in the atmosphere began to shift. It started with small things. My GPS kept losing signal, even though we were in an area that should have had decent satellite coverage. The display would flicker and show us in impossible locations, sometimes placing us miles away, sometimes showing us as moving backwards. Mike's phone was acting up too, the battery draining despite being fully charged that morning. "Technology," Mike said with a shrug when I mentioned it. "That's why we brought paper maps, right?" But when I pulled out the topographical map we'd studied extensively, the trail markers didn't match what we were seeing. According to the map, we should have crossed 3 separate creek beds by now, but we'd only encountered one. The elevation markers were all wrong too. "Maybe we took a wrong turn somewhere," I suggested, though I couldn't remember seeing any forks in the trail. Mike studied the map, frowning. "This doesn't make sense. We've been following the same path the whole time." He looked around at the towering trees that seemed to press closer with each passing hour. "Everything looks the same out here." By late afternoon, we decided to make camp in a small clearing beside what the map claimed was Graves Creek, though the waterway looked nothing like the wide stream depicted on paper. It was barely a trickle, dark water seeping between moss-covered rocks with an oddly metallic smell. Setting up camp felt wrong too. My tent stakes kept pulling loose from soil that looked solid but gave way like pudding. Mike's sleeping bag, when he unrolled it, was damp despite being stored in a waterproof stuff sack. And when we tried to start a fire, the wood, which should have been dry, hissed and smoked but wouldn't catch. "Weird," Mike said for the 3rd time that day, though his usual grin was starting to look forced. "Maybe everything's damper than it looks." When we finally got a fire going, it burned wrong. The flames were too blue, too cold, and they threw strange shadows that seemed to move independently of the flickering light. The smoke didn't rise straight up as it should have, instead flowing downward like heavy fog, pooling around our feet. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with sounds I didn't recognize. Not the usual night noises of owls and settling branches, but something else. Whispers, almost, or maybe wind through caves, though there were no caves marked on our map. Sometimes it sounded like voices calling from deep in the trees, just at the edge of understanding. "You hear that?" I asked Mike as we sat by our struggling fire, picking at our dehydrated dinner. "Hear what?" "Those voices, like people calling for help." Mike cocked his head, listening. "Just wind, man. Makes all kinds of weird noises in trees this thick." But I could swear I heard my name being called. "Robert. Robert." faint and distant, but definitely my name. Mike didn't seem to hear it. He was acting normal, telling me about a funny encounter he'd had with a customer last month, but something about his demeanor was off. He kept glancing at the tree line, and twice I caught him looking at me with an expression I couldn't read, studying me like I was a problem he needed to solve. Sleep was nearly impossible. Every time I started to doze, I'd jerk awake to the sound of footsteps circling our camp. When I'd listen carefully, they'd stop. When I'd start to relax, they'd start again, always just outside the weak circle of light from our dying fire. Around 3 in the morning, I was startled awake by Mike sitting bolt upright in his sleeping bag. "What is it?" I whispered. He was staring into the darkness beyond our camp, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" "Someone called my name." I listened but heard only the whisper wind in the trees. "I don't hear anything." Mike continued staring into the darkness for another full minute before slowly lying back down. "Must have been dreaming," he said, but his voice was flat, emotionless, different. The next morning brought no relief. Our supplies, which we'd carefully hung in a bear bag 15 feet off the ground, had somehow gotten down and scattered around the camp. Worse, half our food was rotted, not just spoiled, but black and liquefied as if it had been decaying for weeks. The smell was overwhelming, like roadkill in summer heat. "Animals," I suggested weakly, though no animal could have reached our bag where we'd hung it. Mike was gathering up what remained of our provisions, his movements mechanical. "Must have been." "Mike, are you feeling okay? You seem—" "I'm fine." He turned to look at me, and for just a moment I could have sworn his eyes reflected the morning light like an animal's. Why wouldn't I be fine? We broke camp and continued hiking, following what we hoped was still the trail, though the path seemed to change when we weren't looking directly at it. Sometimes it would fork unexpectedly, other times it would simply end at an impassable wall of undergrowth that we'd swear hadn't been there moments before. Mike grew quieter as the day progressed. Gone were his usual jokes and observations. Instead, he walked with purposeful strides, never seeming to tire, never needing to check the map or consult his compass. It was as if he knew exactly where we were going, though we were completely lost. "How do you know which way to go?" I asked during one of our brief rest stops. "Just following the trail," he said without looking at me. "What trail? I can barely see a path anymore." Mike turned to face me then, and his smile was all wrong. Too wide, showing too many teeth. "Don't worry, Robert. I know exactly where we're going." That afternoon, we came upon what remained of another campsite. At first glance, it looked like campers had left in a hurry. Tent stakes still in the ground, a blackened fire ring, scattered gear, but as we got closer, the wrongness became apparent. The tent had been shredded from the inside, the fabric hanging in ribbons. Dark stains covered everything, and the smell. The smell was like the rotted food from our camp, but 1,000 times worse. "Jesus," I breathed, covering my nose with my shirt. "What happened here?" Mike walked through the destroyed campsite calmly, nudging items with his boot. "Looks like they had some kind of trouble." "Trouble? This looks like a massacre." I pointed to the shredded tent, the dark stains, the scattered bones that were definitely not animal remains. "We need to report this. These people might need help." "What people?" Mike asked, looking genuinely puzzled. "This campsite's been abandoned for years. Look how rusted everything is." But that wasn't true. The metal stakes were clean, the fire ring still contained warm ashes. This destruction was recent, maybe hours old. "Mike, we need to get out of here. Something's really wrong." "Nothing's wrong," he said, that too wide smile returning. "Everything's exactly as it should be." As evening approached, Mike suggested we make camp in another small clearing, this one surrounded by dead trees that stood like skeletal fingers against the darkening sky. I wanted to keep moving, get as far from that destroyed campsite as possible, but Mike insisted. "We need rest," he said. "Tomorrow we'll reach civilization." "How do you know that? We've been lost for 2 days." Mike began setting up his tent with mechanical precision. I just know. That night, things got worse. Much worse. I was awakened by the sound of my tent zipper being opened. In the dim moonlight filtering through the dead branches above, I could see a figure crouched at my tent entrance. My heart hammered as I realized it was Mike, but something was fundamentally wrong with his silhouette. His proportions seemed off, limbs too long, head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Mike?" I whispered. The figure froze, then slowly turned its head toward me. In the darkness, I couldn't make out features, but I could feel its attention like a physical weight. "Robert," it said in Mike's voice, but wrong somehow, like a recording played at the wrong speed. "Come outside, I want to show you something." Every instinct screamed at me to stay in my tent, zip it closed, pretend this wasn't happening. But this was my friend, my buddy since college. Despite everything strange that had been happening, surely Mike wouldn't hurt me. "What is it?" I asked, my mouth dry. "Something beautiful. Something you need to see." I unzipped my sleeping bag and crawled toward the tent entrance. The figure, Mike, was silhouetted against the starlight, but as I got closer, I could see details that made my blood freeze. His stance was all wrong. Weight distributed like he was preparing to pounce. His fingers seemed too long, ending in what might have been claws. And his smell. He smelled like the destroyed campsite, like rotting meat and old blood. "Mike, are you okay? You look." He lunged. I threw myself backward as claws raked the air where my face had been a split second before. The thing that looked like Mike snarled, an inhuman sound no throat should be able to make, and pressed its attack. I scrambled backward through my tent, feeling the fabric tear as claws slashed through where I'd been lying. Bursting out the back of my tent, I ran blindly into the forest. Behind me, I could hear pursuit. Not footsteps, but something moving through the underbrush with terrifying speed and purpose. Branches whipped my face, roots caught my feet, but panic gave me strength and speed I'd never possessed. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, finally collapsing behind a massive cedar trunk. In the distance, I could hear it searching, circling, calling my name in Mike's voice. "Robert, where are you, buddy? I'm sorry I scared you. Come back to camp." The voice was perfectly Mike's, concerned and apologetic. If I hadn't seen those claws, hadn't smelled that rotting meat stench, I might have believed it. I was just playing around. You know how I like to joke. Come on, man. Don't be like this. I pressed myself against the tree trunk, trying to control my breathing, trying to think. What had happened to Mike? When had he changed? I thought back over the last 2 days, looking for clues. His strange behavior after that first night. The way he'd seemed to know where we were going despite being lost. The destroyed campsite that he'd claimed was old, but clearly wasn't. "Robert, I'm getting worried. This isn't safe. There are things in these woods." The voice was getting closer. I could hear branches breaking as the mic thing searched for me. In the moonlight, I caught glimpses of a tall figure moving between the trees with inhuman grace. Sometimes it moved on 2 legs, sometimes it seemed to flow on all 4s, but it always wore Mike's voice. "Please, man, I'm scared too. We need to stick together." That's when I understood. The real Mike was gone. Had been gone since that first night when he'd sat up staring into the darkness. Something had taken him. Taken his appearance, his voice, his memories. Something that was now hunting me. I began moving as quietly as possible through the forest, using the massive tree trunks for cover. I needed to get back to our camp, get my gear, get out of these woods. But every direction looked the same in the darkness, and the thing wearing Mike's face was still calling my name. "I found something, Robert. Something that explains everything. You need to see this." The voice was coming from directly ahead of me now. I froze, pressing myself against another tree trunk. Through the undergrowth, I could see it standing in a small clearing, no longer making any pretense of being human. It was tall, far taller than Mike had been, with elongated limbs and fingers that ended in curved claws. Its skin seemed to shift and writhe in the moonlight like it was trying to decide what shape to take. but worst of all was its face. It still looked like Mike, but wrong. Features stretched and distorted like a photograph that had been pulled too hard. "I know you're close," it said, Mike's voice coming from that horrible stretched face. "I can smell your fear." It began moving again, quarterbacking through the forest with predatory patience. I waited until it passed, then began moving in the opposite direction. But the forest seemed to be working against me. Paths I'd taken led nowhere. Clearings I'd passed appeared again and again, and all the while that thing kept calling my name with increasing frustration. As dawn began to break, I finally stumbled back into our campsite. Both tents were still standing, our gear scattered around the dead fire ring. I grabbed my backpack, stuffing it with whatever supplies I could find. My hands shook as I tried to work the zippers, the clasps, the simple mechanisms that seemed impossibly complex in my terror. That's when I heard it behind me. Robert. I turned slowly. The mic thing stood at the edge of the clearing, and in the growing daylight I could see it clearly for the first time. It had given up trying to maintain human proportions. Its limbs were too long, joints bending in impossible directions. Its face was a horrible approximation of my friend's features, like a wax figure left too close to heat. But its eyes were completely black, reflecting nothing. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," it said in Mike's voice. "I just want to talk." "What are you?" I managed to whisper. It tilted its head with bird-like curiosity. "I'm your friend. I'm Mike." "No, Mike is gone. Mike is right here." It gestured to itself with those impossibly long fingers. "I have all his memories. I know how you met in Professor Harrison's biology class. I know about the time you got food poisoning from that sushi place and he took care of you. I know you cried when your divorce was finalized and he drove 3 hours just to sit with you and drink beer." The memories were right. Every detail was perfect. But the thing speaking them was an abomination. "I know you," it continued, stepping closer. "I know you're scared of being alone. That's why you need friends, why you cling to people. That's why this trip was so important to you. You're terrified of abandonment." Each word hit like a physical blow because they were true. How could this thing know Mike so completely? "So, I won't abandon you," it said, spreading its arms wide. "I'll be Mike forever. We can be friends forever. All you have to do is let me close enough to touch you." "What happened to the real Mike?" The thing's smile stretched impossibly wide. "He's here. He's part of me now. All his thoughts, all his feelings, all his love for you. Isn't that what you want? A friend who will never leave?" I backed away, clutching my pack. "You're not him. I'm better than him." The thing began moving toward me with fluid, predatory grace. "I'll never get tired of you. I'll never find someone else I'd rather spend time with. I'll never move away or get married or have children who become more important than our friendship. I'll be yours forever." It was close enough now that I could smell the rotting meat stench rolling off it in waves. This close, I could see that its skin wasn't skin at all, but something that looked like badly tanned hide stitched together with sinew. "Just let me touch you," it whispered with Mike's voice. "Just once." I ran. This time, I knew where I was going. I'd seen the trail marker when we'd first entered this clearing, a small metal sign indicating the direction back to the main trail. If I could reach civilization, find other people, maybe this thing would leave me alone. But as I ran, I could hear it following. Not chasing, following. It was playing with me, letting me think I might escape while staying close enough to catch me whenever it chose. And it was laughing with Mike's laugh, the sound echoing through the forest like a soundtrack to my nightmare. The trees began to thin as I climbed higher, and finally I broke through into a larger clearing where I could see the valley spread out below. There, maybe 2 miles away, was the ranger station where we'd started our hike. So close. If I could just keep ahead of the thing for another hour. "Robert, stop." I turned. The mic thing stood at the edge of the clearing, no longer bothering to maintain even the pretense of human movement. It flowed across the ground like liquid shadow, its form shifting and writhing. "You can't leave these woods," it said, "not without me." "Watch me?" "No," it said, and for the first time, there was something other than amusement in its voice. "You don't understand. I need you. I've been alone here so long, wearing the faces of people who wandered too far from the trails. But they were strangers. Their memories meant nothing to me. But you have a connection to this face I'm wearing. You love him. I loved Mike. Not you. I am Mike," it screamed, its form becoming more monstrous with each word. "I have his memories, his feelings, his—" "You have his skin," I said. "That's all." The thing's face contorted with rage, and suddenly it was rushing toward me with inhuman speed. I dove to the side, rolling down the slope as claws whistled through the air where I'd been standing. Rocks and debris cascaded around me as I tumbled, and I came to rest against a fallen log with my ribs screaming in pain. The Mike thing was already moving after me, flowing down the slope like smoke. I struggled to my feet and kept running, but my legs were weakening and my pack felt like it was full of stones. Behind me, I could hear it getting closer. That's when I saw them. The bones scattered around the base of a massive fir tree. Human bones, picked clean, arranged in a rough circle like some kind of shrine. And hanging from the branches above were pieces of clothing, backpacks, personal items. This thing had been hunting hikers for years, maybe decades. Among the bones, I spotted something that made my heart stop. A wallet, weathered but still recognizable. I'd seen Mike pull that wallet out 100 times to pay for dinner, buy movie tickets, split gas money. The real Mike's wallet. "You've been busy," I called out, no longer running. There was nowhere left to go anyway. The thing emerged from the trees, moving more cautiously now. They wandered into my territory, just like you did. "How long have you been out here?" "Time doesn't matter here." It circled me like a predator, staying just out of reach. But I've been hungry for so long, hungry for connection, for understanding. Most people who come here are strangers to each other, hikers who barely know each other's names. But you and Mike, you had history. You had love. Had, past tense. Has, it corrected. Present tense. I can feel how much you cared for him. It's beautiful. It's exactly what I've been searching for. I looked around the circle of bones, at the personal effects hanging from the tree branches like macabre Christmas ornaments. All these people, they had connections too. Families, friends. Distant connections. Shallow relationships. Not like yours. The thing's voice was becoming dreamy, almost reverential. I want to understand what it feels like to be truly loved. To have someone who would drive 3 hours just to sit with you when you're sad. Then you should have asked Mike instead of killing him. "I didn't kill him," the thing said, sounding genuinely offended. "I absorbed him. He's part of me now. His memories, his personality, his feelings for you, they're all here. Isn't that a kind of immortality?" I thought about Mike's laugh echoing through the forest, about how perfectly this thing replicated his mannerisms and speech patterns. Was some part of my friend still alive in there, trapped inside this abomination? "If Mike is really part of you," I said slowly, "then let me talk to him." The thing cocked its head, considering. "You are talking to him." "No, to the real Mike. Let him speak." For a moment, the creature's form flickered, becoming more human. Its features sharpened into a perfect replica of my friend's face, and when it spoke, the voice was exactly right. "Robert," it said, and tears began streaming down its cheeks. "I'm so sorry. I tried to fight it, but it's so strong. It got into my head that first night and I couldn't stop it from taking everything. All my memories of you, of us, of everyone I've ever cared about." "Mike!" I stepped closer, hope flaring in my chest. "It hurts, man. being trapped in here with this thing, feeling it use my feelings for you as bait. I never wanted this. I never wanted to hurt you. How do I get you out? Mike's face contorted with pain. You can't. It's too late for me, but you can still run. It needs physical contact to take you completely. If you can make it to the ranger station. The thing's form suddenly shifted back to its monstrous shape, and Mike's voice was cut off mid-sentence. Clever, the creature snarled, but he's not really separate from me anymore. Those were just echoes, memories playing back. The real Mike is gone. But something in the creature's tone suggested it was lying. Or maybe not lying, but not telling the whole truth either. If Mike's personality was really integrated into this thing, then maybe there was a way to use that. You want to understand love? I asked. Yes. Then you need to understand that love sometimes means letting go. If you really have Mike's feelings, then you know he would never want to hurt me. The creature paused, its monstrous features flickering again. For just a moment, I could see Mike's face looking out at me with desperate eyes. But I need you, it said in Mike's voice. I've been alone for so long. I know, but this isn't the way. It's the only way I know. I thought about all the bones scattered around this place, all the people who had died because they'd wandered too far into this thing's territory. How many families had lost loved ones? How many friends had never gotten answers about what happened to people who'd simply vanished in the woods? Mike always said the wilderness could be dangerous, I said quietly. He used to joke that the real danger wasn't bears or mountain lions. It was getting so lost you forgot who you were. The creature's form was shifting constantly now, flickering between Mike's appearance and something far more monstrous. I remember who I am. Do you? Because I think you've been out here so long, wearing so many different faces, that you've forgotten what you really are. You're not Mike. You're not any of these people you've killed. You're something else entirely. And you're using their memories to try to feel human. I am human, it screamed, its voice echoing off the surrounding mountains. No, you're lonely, and loneliness has made you into a monster. The thing stood perfectly still for a long moment, its form solidifying into something that was almost Mike, but not quite, like looking at him through distorted glass. What would you have me do? It asked quietly. Let them go. All of them. Let Mike rest. And be alone again? Yes. The creature considered this, its Mike face twisting with what might have been grief. I don't think I can. The loneliness, it hurts worse than anything. I know it does, but that's what makes you human, the capacity to hurt. For a moment, just a moment, the thing's face was perfectly Mike's. I'm scared, Robert. I know. Mike was always scared of being alone too, but he learned that sometimes you have to face that fear instead of running from it. The creature closed its eyes, and when it opened them again, they were Mike's eyes. Not the black, reflective orbs of the monster, but the warm, brown eyes I'd known for over a decade. Robert, Mike's voice said, clear and true, run. I ran. Behind me, I heard a sound like the world tearing apart, a scream of rage and loss and profound ancient loneliness that seemed to shake the very mountains. The ground trembled under my feet as I stumbled down the slope toward the valley, and when I looked back, I saw something impossible. The thing was tearing itself apart, its form split and writhed, different faces and bodies emerging and dissolving in rapid succession. I saw glimpses of all the people it had taken over the years, hikers and campers who had made the mistake of wandering too far from the marked trails. And in the center of it all, holding it together by sheer force of will, was Mike. Go! He screamed, and his voice carried over the sound of reality coming unraveled. Don't look back! I didn't. I ran until I reached the ranger station. Ran until I found people with radios and phones and all the trappings of civilization. I told them about Mike, about the destroyed campsite, about getting lost in the woods. I didn't tell them about the creature. Who would believe such a story? They sent search teams, of course, spent weeks combing the forest around Quinault River. They found our abandoned campsite, found signs of struggle, found some of Mike's gear scattered around that circle of bones beneath the fir tree. But they never found Mike's body. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead, victim of a hiking accident or animal attack. The bones they found were attributed to previous missing persons cases, hikers who had vanished over the years in that remote section of the Olympic Forest. I never told anyone what really happened. Who would believe that my best friend had been replaced by something ancient and hungry, something that fed on human connection and love? Who would understand that in the end, Mike had saved me by choosing to destroy the very thing that was using his face to hunt? But sometimes, late at night, I wonder if I made the right choice. That creature had been so lonely, had suffered for so long, and it really did seem to have Mike's memories, his feelings, his capacity for friendship. Was there really such a clear line between the monster and the man it was imitating? I've never gone camping again. Never set foot in wilderness areas that aren't thoroughly mapped and regularly patrolled. Because I know now that there are things in the deep woods that we don't understand. Things that hunger for the connections that make us human. And sometimes when I'm feeling particularly alone, which happens more often than I care to admit, I hear Mike's voice calling my name from somewhere far away, somewhere beyond the reach of civilization and safety. It sounds like an invitation. It sounds like forgiveness. It sounds like a friend who's been waiting for me to come back and finish our conversation. I won't go. I can't. Because I know that the thing wearing Mike's face is still out there, still hungry, still searching for someone who will understand its loneliness. And I know that if I went back, if I let it touch me, I would become just another echo in its collection of stolen lives. But God help me. Some nights I'm tempted. Because the loneliness is so much worse when you've seen what waits in the dark spaces between the trees. When you know that there are monsters out there who understand exactly how it feels to be utterly, completely alone. Mike saved me that day in the forest. The least I can do is honor his sacrifice by staying alive, by staying human, by remembering him as he really was and not as the thing that wore his face. But the nights are long, and the memories are fading, and sometimes I forget the sound of his real laugh versus the echo of it that came from something else's throat. Sometimes I wonder if that was the point all along. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Olympic Peninsula, deep in the temperate rainforest near the Hoh River in Washington state, where the ancient cedars grow so thick they blot out the sun even at midday. The four of us had planned this camping trip for months: Jessica Davis, Ryan Nelson, Amanda Wright, and myself. We'd been friends since college, and with our demanding jobs pulling us in different directions, these annual wilderness escapes had become sacred. Jessica, a forensic accountant with nerves of steel, had suggested the Hoh Rainforest after reading about its pristine beauty online. Ryan, our group's eternal optimist and amateur photographer, was thrilled about capturing the moss-draped trees in their otherworldly splendor. Amanda, a pediatric nurse with an adventurous spirit, just wanted to disconnect from the city's chaos. We should have listened to the ranger at the visitor center. "You folks sure about camping that far up the river?" Ranger Martinez had asked, her weathered face creased with concern as she examined our backcountry permit. "Had some unusual activity reported in that area lately. Might want to consider one of the established campgrounds instead." When Ryan pressed her for details, she'd grown evasive. "Just wildlife disturbances. Probably nothing, but you can never be too careful." Jessica had laughed it off. "What's the worst that could happen? A curious bear?" Now, as I write this with bandaged hands that still shake, I know exactly what the worst can be. The first day's hike had been everything we'd hoped for. The trail wound through cathedral groves of Sitka spruce and western hemlock, their trunks so massive that our group holding hands couldn't encircle them. Emerald moss carpeted every surface, transforming the forest into something from a fairy tale. The sound of the Hoh River provided a constant whisper through the trees, and Ryan's camera clicked incessantly as he documented every shaft of filtered sunlight. We'd made camp in a small clearing about 8 miles from the trailhead, beside a bend in the river where the water ran clear and cold. The site was perfect. Level ground, access to fresh water, and surrounded by the kind of pristine wilderness that made you feel like the first humans to ever walk the earth. That feeling, as it turned out, was dangerously naive. The first sign something was wrong came as we were setting up our tents. Amanda was struggling with her tent poles when she suddenly stopped, her head tilted like a bird listening for predators. "Do you guys hear that?" she whispered. We all froze, straining our ears. The forest had gone silent. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, no insects buzzing. Even the river seemed to have lowered its voice to barely audible murmur. It was the kind of complete silence that makes your eardrums ache. "Probably just coincidence," Ryan said, but his usual cheerfulness seemed forced. Animals go quiet sometimes. The silence stretched for another minute before the forest gradually came alive again. Birds resumed their calls, squirrels chattered in the canopy, and the river returned to its normal burble. We exchanged glances but said nothing more about it. By evening, we'd almost forgotten the incident. We'd gathered around our campfire, sharing stories and passing around a bottle of whiskey Jessica had smuggled in her pack. Ryan regaled us with tales from his recent assignment photographing a music festival, complete with exaggerated impressions of pretentious band members. Amanda told us about her latest case, a 7-year-old who'd swallowed his mother's engagement ring and the elaborate surgery required to retrieve it. The fire crackled cheerfully, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. Above us, stars emerged between the canopy gaps, more brilliant than any of us city dwellers were used to seeing. It felt magical, like we were sharing secrets with the ancient forest itself. Then Jessica's GPS watch started glitching. "That's weird," she said, staring at the display. "It says we're 12 miles northwest of our actual position. We're supposedly in the middle of the Queets River Valley." Ryan pulled out his phone. "Mine's showing the same thing. Actually, it's worse. According to this, we're not even in Washington anymore. It thinks we're in northern Canada." I checked my own device. The GPS was spinning wildly, unable to get a fix on our location. One moment it showed us in British Columbia, the next in Alaska, then somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. "Solar flares," Amanda suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. I read something about them affecting electronics. But there was something deeply unsettling about the way all our devices had failed simultaneously. Technology was supposed to be reliable, a constant in our modern lives. Having it suddenly become unreliable felt like losing our anchor to the civilized world. The fire seemed dimmer after that, the shadows deeper and more menacing. We tried to maintain our light-hearted conversation, but an undercurrent of unease had crept in. Every sound from the forest, the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, made us glance nervously into the darkness beyond our small circle of light. When we finally decided to turn in, Ryan volunteered for first watch. "Just want to get some night shots of the forest," he explained, patting his camera. "The way the moonlight filters through the canopy should be incredible." I should have insisted we all stay together. I should have trusted the instinct that was already whispering warnings in the back of my mind. Instead, I crawled into my sleeping bag and tried to ignore the feeling that something in the darkness was watching us. I woke to Amanda's frantic shaking. "Michael, wake up! Ryan's gone!" The words hit me like cold water. I sat up, immediately alert, and looked around our campsite. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and Ryan's tent was empty, its door hanging open. "When did you last see him?" I asked, pulling on my boots. "He never woke me for my watch," Amanda said, her voice tight with worry. "That was supposed to be at 2 a.m. It's almost 5 now." Jessica emerged from her tent, already fully dressed. "His camera's still here," she said, holding up Ryan's expensive DSLR. "He'd never leave this behind voluntarily." The forest around us was beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn, But the pale light only made the shadows seem deeper and more threatening. We called Ryan's name, our voices echoing strangely among the trees, but received no response. "We should search systematically," Jessica said, falling back on her methodical nature. "Stay within sight of each other, but spread out enough to cover ground." We spent the next 2 hours combing the area around our campsite. We found Ryan's footprints leading away from the fire toward the river, but the trail vanished at the water's edge on a bed of smooth stones. There was no sign of a struggle, no torn clothing or dropped belongings. It was as if he'd simply walked into the water and dissolved. "We need to contact the rangers," Amanda said. "But when we tried our emergency radios, we got nothing but static. Our cell phones still couldn't locate any satellites. The feeling of isolation was beginning to press down on us like a physical weight." We were 8 miles from the nearest trail marker with no way to communicate with the outside world, and one of our group had vanished without a trace. "He probably just got disoriented," I said, trying to convince myself as much as the others. "Found an interesting photo opportunity and lost track of time. He'll show up any minute, embarrassed and apologetic." But as the morning wore on and Ryan failed to appear, that explanation felt increasingly hollow. We were discussing whether to break camp and hike out for help when we heard him calling, "Guys, I'm back. Sorry about that." The relief was overwhelming. Ryan emerged from the tree line on the far side of our camp, waving cheerfully. He looked perfectly normal. Same clothes, same easy grin, same slightly tousled hair he never bothered to comb. "Jesus, Ryan." Amanda rushed to him, tears streaming down her face. "We thought something had happened to you." Sorry, he said, accepting her hug with what seemed like mild confusion. I saw this incredible shot down by the river and got carried away. You know how I am with the camera." But he wasn't carrying his camera, and something about his expression seemed flat. His smile was there, but it didn't reach his eyes. They were the same brown eyes we'd known for 7 years, but they seemed somehow empty, like windows in an abandoned house. "You've been gone for hours," Jessica said, studying his face. We were about to hike out for help. "Hours?" Ryan blinked slowly as if the concept confused him. It couldn't have been more than 30 minutes. I watched him carefully as he spoke. There was something fundamentally wrong, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. His mannerisms were right, his voice sounded normal, but there was a quality of wrongness that made my skin crawl. "Where's your camera?" Amanda asked. Ryan looked down at his empty hands with apparent surprise. "I must have left it somewhere. I'll go get it." He turned back toward the forest, but Jessica caught his arm. "Let's all go together. We don't want anyone else wandering off." For just a moment, something flickered across Ryan's face. Annoyance, maybe, or frustration. Then his usual pleasant expression returned. "Of course. Good thinking." The 4 of us headed into the forest where Ryan claimed to have been photographing. He led us confidently through the undergrowth, but I noticed he never seemed to look for his camera. His eyes were focused ahead, as if he knew exactly where he was going. We walked for 20 minutes without finding any sign of the camera. The forest grew denser, the canopy thicker, until we were walking in perpetual twilight. The sounds of the river faded behind us, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to muffle even our footsteps. "Ryan," I said finally, "are you sure this is the right direction?" He stopped and turned to face us. When he smiled, I saw that his teeth were stained with something dark. "Oh yes," he said, and his voice had changed. It was still Ryan's voice, but underneath it was something else, something that made harmonics that human vocal cords couldn't produce. "This is exactly where we need to be." That's when I noticed the smell. It was subtle at first, like meat that had been left out too long, but it grew stronger as we stood there. It seemed to be coming from Ryan himself. Amanda must have smelled it too because she took a step backward. "Ryan, are you feeling okay? You look pale." "I feel wonderful," he said, and tilted his head at an angle that was just slightly too far to be natural. "Better than I've ever felt." cleaner, hungrier. Jessica grabbed my arm. Her forensic training had taught her to notice details others missed, and I could see in her face that she'd spotted whatever wrongness I was sensing. "We should head back to camp," she said carefully. "Get you some food and water." "Oh, I'll be eating soon," Ryan said. His smile widened, and I could see that the dark staining on his teeth was definitely blood. "Very soon." The thing wearing Ryan's face began to change. It was subtle at first. His proportions seemed to shift, his limbs growing longer and more angular. His skin took on a grayish pallor, and his hair began falling out in clumps. But the worst part was his eyes. They remained brown, remained recognizably Ryan's, but behind them lurked an intelligence that was ancient and utterly inhuman. "Run," I whispered. We scattered into the forest like startled deer. Behind us, the thing that had been Ryan let out a sound that was part laugh, part howl, part something I have no words for. It echoed through the trees with a quality that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and face. I could hear Amanda and Jessica somewhere to my left, but the forest seemed to swallow sound in unnatural ways. Sometimes their footsteps and panicked breathing sounded close, sometimes impossibly distant. The thing was following us. I could hear it moving through the trees with a fluid grace that no human could match. It wasn't running so much as flowing, and it was gaining ground. I stumbled into a small clearing and found Amanda crouched behind a fallen log, tears streaming down her face. "Where's Jessica?" I gasped. "I don't know," she sobbed. "We got separated. Michael, what was that thing? What happened to Ryan?" Before I could answer, we heard Jessica scream. The sound cut through the forest like a knife, high and desperate and abruptly cut short. Then there was only silence. Amanda and I huddled together behind the log, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Every shadow could hide the creature. Every sound could herald its approach. Then we heard Ryan's voice calling from somewhere nearby. "Guys, where are you? I found my camera." Amanda started to stand, but I pulled her back down. "That's not Ryan," I whispered. "Not anymore." "Michael, Amanda." The voice was closer now, and I could hear the subtle wrongness in it, the harmonics that human throats couldn't produce. "Come on out, Jessica's hurt. She needs help." I closed my eyes, fighting the urge to respond. Every instinct screamed at me to help Jessica, but I knew it was a trap. Whatever had taken Ryan was using our compassion against us. "I can smell you," the thing said, and now its voice had dropped the pretense of being human. It was a rasping whisper that seemed to come from the trees themselves. "I can smell your fear. It makes you so much more delicious." Through a gap in the fallen log, I caught a glimpse of it moving through the trees. It still wore Ryan's face, but the rest of its body had changed completely. It was impossibly tall and thin, with limbs that bent at wrong angles and fingers that ended in black claws. Its skin was the color of old bones, stretched tight over a frame that seemed to be more angles than curves. But the worst part was that it was dragging something behind it, something in torn clothing that might once have been Jessica. Amanda saw it too. She clapped both hands over her mouth to stifle a scream, her whole body shaking with terror. The creature paused in its hunt, its head turning with predatory precision. For a moment, I thought it had spotted us. Then it began to change again, its limbs shortening, its skin taking on a healthier color. Within moments, it looked like Ryan again. Our Ryan, confused and scared. "Guys, this isn't funny anymore," it called, and the voice was perfect now, full of genuine concern. "Jessica's really hurt. I think her leg is broken. We need to get her to a hospital." The performance was flawless. If I hadn't seen the transformation, I might have believed it myself. But I had seen, and I knew that whatever intelligence lurked behind Ryan's stolen face was capable of perfect mimicry. We waited in terrified silence until the sounds of the creature's movement faded into the distance. Only then did I dare to whisper to Amanda. "We have to get back to camp. Get our gear and hike out." She nodded wordlessly, her face pale with shock. Moving as quietly as possible, we began working our way back toward our campsite. The forest seemed different now, more threatening, full of shadows that could hide horrors. Every sound made us freeze. Every movement in our peripheral vision sent spikes of adrenaline through our systems. It took us almost an hour to cover the ground that should have taken 20 minutes. When we finally reached our camp, we found it destroyed. Our tents had been shredded, our supplies scattered and torn apart. Worse, there were bones mixed in with the debris. Old bones, yellowed with age, but some that looked disturbingly fresh. "Oh God," Amanda whispered. "How many people has it killed?" I didn't want to think about that. Instead, I focused on finding anything useful from the wreckage. My backpack was intact, though scattered. Amanda's sleeping bag had survived the destruction. Most importantly, I found my hunting knife, still in its sheath. The radio was destroyed, but I managed to find Amanda's emergency whistle in the remains of her pack. It wasn't much, but it was something. "We need to start hiking," I said. "Get to the main trail and find help." As we prepared to leave, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the soft earth near our destroyed fire pit, there were tracks. They started as human footprints, Ryan's boots, which I recognized from the distinctive tread pattern, but as they moved away from the campsite, they gradually changed. The prints grew longer, the toe impressions deeper and sharper. By the time they reached the edge of our clearing, they looked more like the tracks of some massive predatory bird than anything human. "Amanda," I said quietly, "don't look back. Just start walking toward the trail." We set off through the forest, moving as quickly as we dared while trying to stay quiet. The creature had shown it could track us, but maybe if we moved fast enough we could reach help before it found us again. For the first mile, I began to hope we might make it. The forest seemed normal again. Birds were singing, squirrels chattered in the trees, and the sounds of life returned. But as we got deeper into the wilderness, that oppressive silence began to descend again. That's when we heard Jessica's voice. "Help me! Please, somebody help me!" The voice was coming from somewhere off the main trail, deeper in the forest. Amanda stopped dead, her face torn between terror and hope. "That could really be her," she whispered. "What if she got away? What if she's hurt and needs help?" I wanted to believe it. Every fiber of my being wanted to believe that Jessica had somehow escaped and was calling for rescue. But I remembered the thing dragging her broken body through the forest, and I knew it was another trick. "It's not her," I said firmly. "Keep walking." "Help! Oh God, please, it's coming back." The voice was closer now, and more desperate. It sounded exactly like Jessica. Every inflection, every nuance of terror was perfect. If I closed my eyes, I could almost convince myself it was really her. Amanda took a step toward the sound before I caught her arm. "We can't leave her," she said, tears streaming down her face. "She's already gone," I replied, though saying it felt like swallowing glass. "That thing is using her voice to lure us in. You don't know that." But even as she protested, Amanda's expression showed she knew I was right. The perfect mimicry was too good, too convenient. The real Jessica would never have been able to escape something that could move through the forest like flowing water. We forced ourselves to keep walking toward the main trail, leaving the desperate calls behind us. Each step felt like a betrayal, but it was the only way to survive. The creature followed us. We never saw it directly, but we could sense its presence. A wrongness in the forest that made the hair on our necks stand up. Sometimes we'd catch glimpses of movement in our peripheral vision, but when we turned to look, there was nothing there. It was playing with us, I realized. It could have caught us at any time, but it was enjoying the hunt, savoring our fear. As the afternoon wore on, exhaustion began to take its toll. We'd been walking for hours without food or proper rest, and the constant adrenaline was burning through our energy reserves. Amanda was starting to stumble, and I wasn't much better. That's when we heard the voices. "Hello? Is someone out there?" This time, it wasn't Jessica or Ryan. It was a man's voice, older and authoritative. It sounded like a park ranger or search and rescue worker. "We heard your emergency whistle. Where are you?" Hope flared in my chest before common sense crushed it. We hadn't used the whistle yet. And how would rescuers have found us so deep in the wilderness when all our electronics were still malfunctioning? But Amanda was too exhausted and desperate to think clearly. She started to call back before I tackled her, clamping my hand over her mouth. "It's not real," I whispered urgently. "None of it is real." She struggled against me, her eyes wild with desperation. She wanted so badly to believe that help had arrived that she was willing to ignore all the evidence that it was another trap. The fake rescue voices continued calling for several minutes before giving up. In the silence that followed, I heard something that chilled me to the bone. The sound of multiple footsteps moving through the forest with inhuman coordination. The creature wasn't alone anymore, or it was somehow multiplying itself. We pressed on, driven by terror and the rapidly fading hope of escape. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of us, and I began to wonder if we were even still on the right trail. Without GPS, with the sun hidden by the thick canopy, we could be walking in circles for all I knew. As evening approached, bringing with it the promise of another night in this nightmare, I spotted something that made my heart leap. A trail marker. We were still on the right path, and according to the sign, the main trailhead was only 3 miles away. "We can make it," I told Amanda. "Just a little farther." But as darkness began to fall, our pursuit became more aggressive. We could hear it crashing through the underbrush behind us, no longer trying to be stealthy. It was done playing. I pulled out my flashlight and grabbed Amanda's hand. "Run!" We sprinted down the trail, stumbling over roots and rocks in the darkness. Behind us, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. I could hear multiple sets of footsteps now, as if a whole pack of the creatures was chasing us. Then Amanda tripped. She went down hard, crying out as her ankle twisted. I helped her up, but she could barely put weight on her left foot. "Leave me," she gasped. "You can make it if you go alone." "No." I wrapped her arm around my shoulders, supporting her weight. "We stick together." We limped forward as fast as we could manage, but it wasn't fast enough. The sounds behind us were getting closer, and I could smell that sweet scent of decay that seemed to follow the creatures. That's when I saw the lights ahead. Real electric lights, not the cold phosphorescence that sometimes emanated from the creatures. It was the ranger station at the trailhead. "Almost there," I panted. We staggered the last 100 yards to the station, where I pounded on the door until a sleepy ranger opened it. "Please," I gasped. "Help us. Our friends. There's something in the forest." The ranger, whose nameplate read Morrison, immediately recognized the signs of people in genuine distress. He helped us inside, wrapped us in blankets, and called for backup while I tried to explain what had happened. I told him about Ryan's disappearance and return, about the creature that had worn his face, about Jessica's fate. I knew how insane it sounded, but Morrison listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "How many people in your group originally?" he asked when I finished. 4, Ryan, Jessica, Amanda, and me. He nodded grimly. "We'll organize a search party at first light. Right now, you two need medical attention and rest." As EMTs tended to Amanda's ankle and the numerous cuts and scratches we'd both sustained, I found myself staring out the window into the dark forest. Somewhere out there, the creature was waiting. Maybe it was still wearing Ryan's face. Maybe it had taken on another form entirely. But I knew it wasn't done with us. Morrison approached me with a cup of coffee and a serious expression. "Son, I want you to know we take these reports seriously. You're not the first people to come out of that area with unusual stories. Others have seen it? Different details, but similar themes. People going missing, coming back wrong, or not coming back at all. We've had 3 unexplained disappearances in that section of forest over the past 2 years." He paused, studying my face. The local tribal elders have stories about that area. Call it cursed. Say there's something that hunts humans, something that can wear their faces. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. What do they call it? Different names. Most commonly, a Wendigo, a creature of endless hunger that was once human but transformed into something else. They say it can perfectly mimic anyone it's consumed. The implications hit me like a physical blow. If the creature had consumed others before Ryan and Jessica, it might have an entire collection of identities to choose from. It could walk into any town, perfectly mimicking some missing hiker, and no one would know the difference until it was too late. "We have to warn people," I said. Morrison nodded. "We will. But these things, they're hard to prove, hard to track. It might lay low for a while after tonight, find new hunting grounds." Over the following weeks, search teams scoured the area where we'd encountered the creature. They found our destroyed campsite and some scattered bones, but no trace of Ryan or Jessica's bodies. The official report listed them as missing, presumed dead due to wildlife encounter. Only Amanda and I knew the truth. The creature had been clever enough to clean up after itself, removing any evidence that might lead to a deeper investigation. But I knew it was still out there, still hunting. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wondered if it had let us escape on purpose. If our terror-filled account would only add to the local legends, making it easier for the creature to hunt in the future. People expect monsters to be obvious after all. They don't expect them to knock on their door wearing the face of a missing loved one. 3 months later, I got a call that confirmed my worst fears. A hiker had been found in the same area, alive but traumatized, claiming that his friend had vanished and returned wrong. The description he gave of his transformed companion matched exactly what we'd experienced. But here's what keeps me awake at night. The missing friend's name was Marcus Webb. I looked him up in the missing persons database. Marcus Webb had disappeared from a hiking trip in Northern California 6 months before our encounter, hundreds of miles away from where this new incident occurred. The creature wasn't just hunting locally. It was traveling, accumulating identities, building a collection of faces it could wear. And with each victim, it was learning more about human behavior, becoming more sophisticated in its mimicry. I've tried to warn people, tried to get authorities to take the threat seriously, but how do you explain something that sounds like the ravings of a trauma victim? How do you convince someone that their missing brother or sister might not actually be missing, but hunting? Amanda moved across the country after our ordeal, trying to put distance between herself and the memories. We still talk occasionally, but the conversations are stilted, painful. We're both trying to forget something that refuses to be forgotten. Sometimes I catch myself studying strangers' faces, looking for subtle signs that they might not be what they appear. I've become paranoid about people who seem slightly off, whose smiles don't quite reach their eyes, who blink too little or hold eye contact too long. Because somewhere out there, the Wendigo is still hunting, still adding faces to its collection, still learning how to be human while remaining utterly inhuman at its core. And the worst part, after all this time, I'm not even sure I'd recognize it if I saw it again. It's had months to practice, to perfect its mimicry. It could be anyone now. The helpful park ranger, the concerned EMT, the sympathetic police officer taking your missing person report. It could be your best friend, returned from a camping trip with a smile that doesn't quite fit their face. It could be anyone at all. I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, certain I can smell that sweet scent of decay drifting through my bedroom window. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I hear Ryan's voice calling my name from the darkness outside, but I never answer, because I know that whatever is calling, it isn't Ryan anymore. It never was. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the Hoh Rainforest, deep within Olympic National Forest in Washington state, where the ancient trees grow so thick that sunlight becomes a memory and darkness feels alive. I should have listened to the park ranger at the visitor center. Should have paid attention when her weathered face went pale as she traced our planned route on the topographical map with a trembling finger. Should have asked why she kept glancing toward the emergency radio behind her desk, as if expecting it to crackle with bad news. But I was too excited, too eager to prove something to myself and to Danny. My best friend since college, Danny Martinez, had been struggling since his divorce 6 months ago. The drinking had gotten worse, the late-night calls more frequent, the silences between us longer and more uncomfortable. This trip was supposed to fix things. 3 days of hiking and camping in some of the most pristine wilderness left in America. Just 2 guys, some gear, and the kind of honest conversation that only happens when you're miles from civilization. "You sure about this route?" the ranger had asked one more time, her nameplate reading K. Morrison in faded letters. "The Hoh River Trail gets pretty isolated past the 17-mile shelter. We don't get many hikers heading into the Bogachiel Creek area this time of year." "We'll be fine," I'd assured her, hefty pack already strapped to my shoulders. "We've both done plenty of backcountry camping." That was true, technically. We'd hiked sections of the Appalachian Trail, spent weekends in the Adirondacks, even tackled part of the John Muir Trail the summer after graduation. But the Pacific Northwest was different. Everything here felt older, more primal. The trees weren't just tall. They were ancient sentinels that had stood for centuries before the first Europeans set foot on this continent. The forest floor wasn't just soft. It was a thick carpet of decomposing matter that seemed to pulse with its own dark life. We'd started early that morning, driving up from Seattle in Danny's aging Toyota Tacoma, windows down to let in the crisp October air. The plan was simple. Hike 12 miles in to establish base camp near Bogachiel Creek, spend 2 nights exploring the area, then hike out on the 3rd day. Danny had been quiet during the drive, nursing a thermos of coffee that I suspected was liberally spiked with something stronger, but his mood seemed to improve once we hit the trailhead. "Jesus, Mike," he'd said, shouldering his pack and breathing deep. "When's the last time we did something like this? Just the 2 of us." I'd grinned and started up the trail, my boots crunching on the carpet of fallen leaves. "Too long, brother, too damn long." The first few hours were perfect. The Hoh River Trail was well maintained and clearly marked, winding through stands of Sitka spruce and western hemlock that seemed to stretch endlessly skyward. Shafts of golden sunlight filtered down through the canopy, illuminating patches of brilliant green moss that covered everything like nature's own velvet. Danny's spirits lifted with each mile, and soon we were talking and laughing like the old days. But as we moved deeper into the forest, subtle changes began to assert themselves. The trail became less distinct, requiring frequent consultation of our topographical map. The trees grew closer together, their massive trunks creating a natural barrier that blocked out more and more light. The cheerful babble of the Hoh River, which had been our constant companion, faded to a distant whisper and then disappeared entirely as we veered north toward Bogachiel Creek. By late afternoon, we'd covered about 10 miles, and the forest around us had transformed into something altogether different. The trees here were massive, Douglas firs and western red cedars with trunks wider than my apartment back in Seattle. Moss hung from their branches like tattered curtains, and the understory was so thick with fallen logs and tangled vegetation that it felt like we were walking through a green tunnel. "This place is incredible," Danny said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier enthusiasm. "Kind of gives you the creeps, though, like we're being watched." I laughed it off, but I knew what he meant. There was something about the deep forest that made you hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow. The normal woodland noises, birdsong, the rustle of small animals, the whisper of wind through leaves, seemed muted here, as if the forest were holding its breath. We made camp that evening in a small clearing beside what our map indicated was Bogachiel Creek, though the waterway was little more than a thin trickle meandering between moss-covered rocks. Danny got to work setting up his tent while I gathered firewood, grateful for any excuse to move around and shake off the odd unease that had been building all afternoon. That's when I found the first sign that something was wrong. About 50 yards from our campsite, I came across a tree that stopped me cold. It was a massive red cedar, easily 8 feet in diameter, but its bark had been stripped away in long, parallel gouges that spiraled around the trunk from ground level to about 12 feet up. The gouges were too wide and too deep to have been made by any animal I could think of. Bear claws would leave different marks. These looked almost like someone had taken a garden rake to the tree, if garden rakes were made of steel and wielded by something incredibly strong. I ran my fingers along one of the gouges. The wood inside was fresh, still oozing sap. This had happened recently, very recently. "Danny," I called, trying to keep my voice casual. "Come check this out." He appeared through the undergrowth, took one look at the tree, and let out a low whistle. What the hell did that? I don't know. Maybe a bear marking its territory? But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. I'd seen bear sign before. This was something else entirely. Danny circled the tree, his photographer's eye taking in details I'd missed. "Look at the pattern," he said, pointing to the gouges. "They're too regular, too deliberate. And see how they spiral up? It's like something was climbing the tree while it clawed it." A chill ran down my spine. I thought about the park ranger's pale face, her reluctance to let us venture into this particular area. "Maybe we should head back to the main trail tomorrow," I suggested. "There's plenty to see without going deeper into the backcountry." Danny shot me a look I recognized from our college days, the same expression he'd worn before talking me into all sorts of questionable adventures. "Come on, Mike. Don't tell me you're spooked by a few claw marks. We've hiked hundreds of miles together. A little wilderness weirdness never stopped us before." He was right, of course. We'd encountered strange things in the woods before. Mysterious sounds, unexplained tracks, even the occasional odd smell or visual anomaly that defied explanation. The wilderness was full of mysteries, and part of the appeal of backcountry hiking was accepting that you were entering a realm where human understanding didn't always apply. We returned to camp and got a fire going as the sun began to set. Danny broke out a bottle of whiskey to go with our freeze-dried dinners, and soon we were sharing stories and laughing at old memories. The strange tree faded to the back of my mind, just another wilderness mystery to add to our collection. But as full darkness settled over the forest, the unease returned. It started with the silence, not the peaceful quiet of a forest at rest, but something deeper and more unsettling. No owls hooted, no small animals rustled through the undergrowth. Even the thin creek beside our camp seemed to flow more quietly, as if the water itself was trying not to make noise. "Is it just me?" Danny said, poking at the fire with a stick. "Or does it feel like everything just stopped?" I'd been thinking the same thing. The forest around us felt empty in a way that didn't make sense. We were deep in some of the most biodiverse wilderness in North America, and this place should be alive with nocturnal activity. Instead, it felt like we were sitting in a vast, green tomb. "Probably just the weather," I said, though the night was clear and still. "Maybe a storm coming in." Danny nodded, but I could see he wasn't convinced. He kept glancing over his shoulder at the wall of darkness beyond our fire's reach, as if expecting something to materialize from the shadows. We turned in early, both of us eager to escape the oppressive silence. My tent was a high-quality four-season model designed to withstand anything nature could throw at it, but as I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the absolute quiet outside, it felt as fragile as tissue paper. I must have dozed off because I was awakened sometime later by a sound that made my blood freeze. It was breathing. Slow, deliberate inhalations and exhalations, coming from somewhere just outside my tent. But it wasn't human breathing. The rhythm was wrong, too deep and too measured. Each breath sounded like air being drawn through a narrow opening, creating a wet, whistling quality that made my skin crawl. I lay perfectly still, my heart hammering against my ribs. The breathing continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, slowly circling my tent. I could track its movement by the subtle changes in direction of the sound. Whatever was out there was taking its time, moving deliberately, as if it were studying my tent from every angle. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the breathing stopped. I waited, straining my ears for any hint of movement, but the silence returned. After what felt like an eternity, I worked up the courage to whisper Danny's name. No response. "Danny," I said again, a little louder. Still nothing. His tent was less than 10 feet away, close enough that he should have been able to hear me clearly, close enough that he definitely should have heard whatever had been breathing outside my tent. I unzipped my sleeping bag and crawled to the tent flap, my hands shaking as I worked the zipper. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a faint orange light over our campsite. Danny's tent looked exactly as it had when we'd said goodnight, but something about it seemed wrong. It took me a moment to realize what it was. The tent was perfectly still. No rise and fall of breathing, no small movements of someone shifting in sleep. It looked empty. "Danny?" I called softly. When there was no answer, I forced myself to crawl out of my tent and cross the campsite. The forest around us remained absolutely silent, but I could feel something watching me from the darkness beyond the fire's reach. Every primitive instinct I possessed was screaming at me to get back in my tent and zip it shut, but I had to check on my friend. Danny's tent was zipped shut from the outside, which was odd. If he'd gotten up for any reason during the night, he would have left it open or zipped it from the inside. I pressed my ear to the fabric and listened. Nothing. With trembling fingers, I worked the zipper down and peered inside. Danny's sleeping bag was empty, but it had been unzipped from the inside. His boots were gone, but his headlamp and flashlight were still there, sitting exactly where he'd left them before going to sleep. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe he'd gotten up to relieve himself and had simply walked a little farther from camp than usual. Maybe he'd heard something and gone to investigate. Maybe he'd had trouble sleeping and was sitting by the creek, thinking. But none of those explanations accounted for the careful way his tent had been zipped shut from the outside. I grabbed my flashlight and began searching the area around our campsite, calling Danny's name in increasingly loud whispers. I didn't want to shout. Some deep, animal part of my brain insisted that making too much noise would be a very bad idea. The beam of my flashlight revealed nothing unusual. No footprints in the soft earth around the tents. No signs of struggle. No indication that Danny had ever left his sleeping bag. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, almost masked by the rich, earthy scents of the forest floor. But as I moved around the campsite, it grew stronger. A sickly, sweet odor that reminded me of meat left too long in the sun. The smell seemed to be coming from the direction of the creek, so I followed it, my flashlight beam dancing nervously ahead of me. I found Danny about 30 yards from camp, standing motionless beside the thin stream. "Jesus, Danny," I said, relief flooding through me. "You scared the hell out of me. What are you doing out here?" He didn't respond. Didn't even acknowledge that I'd spoken. He just stood there, perfectly still, staring down at the water. "Danny?" I moved closer, and that's when I saw that something was terribly wrong. He was naked from the waist up, his shirt and jacket lying in a pile beside the creek. His skin was pale in the flashlight beam, almost luminous and covered with what looked like a thin sheen of moisture. But it was his posture that made my stomach clench with fear. He was standing too straight, too rigid, like a mannequin that had been posed and abandoned. "Hey, man, are you okay?" I reached out to touch his shoulder. The moment my fingers made contact with his skin, Danny's head snapped toward me with mechanical precision. His eyes were wide open, but they reflected the flashlight beam like an animal's. And when he smiled, I saw that his teeth had been filed to points. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam wavering. "Danny, what the fuck?" He lunged at me with inhuman speed, his filed teeth aiming for my throat. I threw myself to the side, crashing through the undergrowth as his fingernails, now long and sharp as claws, raked across my shoulder, tearing through my jacket and the skin beneath. I ran. I crashed through the forest blindly, branches whipping at my face, roots catching my feet. Behind me, I could hear Danny pursuing, but it wasn't the sound of human footsteps. It was something else, something that moved through the forest with predatory grace, crackling through the undergrowth like a large animal. My flashlight beam jerked wildly as I ran, illuminating brief snapshots of the nightmare landscape around me. Massive tree trunks that seemed to lean inward as if trying to block my escape, patches of ground that appeared to glisten with moisture in the shifting light. And always, behind me, the sound of pursuit. I don't know how long I ran or how far I traveled. Time seemed to stretch and compress in the darkness. Eventually, my lungs burning and my legs shaking with exhaustion, I found a cluster of fallen logs that formed a natural shelter. I wedged myself into the space between them and tried to control my breathing, listening for any sign that Danny, or whatever Danny had become, was still following me. The forest had returned to its unnatural silence. I sat there in the darkness, my shoulder throbbing where Danny's claws had torn my flesh, trying to make sense of what had happened. People didn't just file their teeth to points overnight. They didn't develop reflective eyes or superhuman speed. They didn't hunt their best friends through the woods like predatory animals. But I'd seen it. I'd felt those claws tear through my jacket. As the hours passed and adrenaline faded, exhaustion began to take hold. Despite every instinct telling me to stay awake and alert, my eyelids grew heavy. The pain in my shoulder had settled to a dull throb, and the rhythmic dripping of moisture from the trees above created a hypnotic pattern that made it difficult to concentrate. I dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every real or imagined sound. In my half-conscious state, I began to hear things that couldn't possibly be there. The distant sound of Danny's laughter echoing through the forest like a sick parody of our earlier conversation around the campfire. Whispered words in a language I didn't recognize, seeming to come from the trees themselves. When dawn finally began to filter through the canopy, I crawled out of my hiding place and took stock of my situation. I was lost, injured, and completely disoriented. My compass was back at camp with the rest of my gear, and the thick forest canopy made it impossible to get a clear view of the sun to determine direction. Worse, I was beginning to doubt my own memory of the previous night's events. In the gray morning light, the idea that my best friend had somehow transformed into a monster seemed absurd. Maybe I'd had a panic attack. Maybe the isolation and strange atmosphere of the deep forest had triggered some kind of psychological break. But when I examined my shoulder, I found 4 parallel tears in my jacket and the shirt beneath, with corresponding scratches on my skin. The wounds were real, even if I was no longer certain about their cause. I spent the morning trying to find my way back to the campsite, using the creek as a guide. But as I followed the thin waterway, I began to suspect that something was fundamentally wrong with the geography of this place. The creek seemed to meander in impossible directions, sometimes flowing uphill, sometimes splitting into multiple channels that rejoined themselves in ways that defied physics. After several hours of walking, I found myself in a clearing that looked exactly like the spot where Danny and I had made camp, but our tents weren't there. Instead, the area was littered with the remains of previous campsites. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, scattered across the clearing in various stages of decay. Torn fabric that might once have been tents hung from tree branches like prayer flags. Rusted camping equipment lay half buried in the moss and fallen leaves. And everywhere, scattered among the debris, were personal items. Eyeglasses, watches, wallets, cell phones, the kind of things people would never willingly leave behind. I picked up one of the wallets and opened it with trembling fingers. The driver's license inside belonged to someone named Thomas Reed, age 34, from Portland, Oregon. The photo showed a smiling man with kind eyes and a beard. The license had expired 6 years ago. A cell phone lying nearby still had charge, though it showed no signal bars. When I scrolled through the photos, I found images of a camping trip that looked eerily similar to the one Danny and I had planned. A group of friends hiking through old-growth forest, pictures of a campsite beside a small creek, selfies around a campfire. The final photos in the sequence made my blood run cold. They showed the same friends, but something was wrong with their faces. Their eyes reflected the camera flash. Their smiles revealed too many teeth, all filed to points. And in the background of each photo, barely visible in the shadows beyond the firelight, stood tall, emaciated figures with elongated limbs and hollow, hungry faces. I dropped the phone and stumbled backward, my mind reeling. This wasn't just about Danny and me. This place was a trap, a killing ground that had been claiming victims for years, and whatever had taken my friend was still out there, waiting. That's when I heard the laughter. It was Danny's laugh, unmistakably his, but wrong in every conceivable way. Too high, too long, with an edge of madness that made my teeth ache. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the forest, beyond the clearing of ruined campsites. I should have run, should have continued trying to find my way out of this nightmare landscape. But the sound of that twisted laughter filled me with a rage that burned through my fear. Whatever had taken my friend, whatever was wearing his face and using his voice, I wasn't going to let it continue. I searched through the scattered camping debris until I found what I was looking for, a rusted but still functional hatchet with a chipped wooden handle. The weight of it in my hand was reassuring, a solid reminder that I wasn't helpless. Following the sound of the laughter, I pushed deeper into the forest. The trees here were different than anything I'd seen before, twisted and gnarled, with bark that seemed to pulse with a sickly bioluminescence in the dim light. The ground beneath my feet was soft and yielding, like walking on a layer of decomposing flesh. The laughter stopped as suddenly as it had started, replaced by that terrible, oppressive silence. But I could smell that sickly sweet odor again, stronger now, mixed with something else, the metallic scent of fresh blood. I found Danny, or the thing that had been Danny, in a natural depression surrounded by the largest trees I'd ever seen. He was crouched over something, his back to me, making wet, tearing sounds that I tried not to identify. "Danny," I called softly. He straightened and turned toward me, and I saw that any resemblance to my friend was now purely superficial. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and his body had stretched and elongated in ways that human anatomy didn't allow. His arms were too long, his fingers extended into claws that dripped with dark fluid. But it was his face that nearly made me lose my grip on the hatchet. His eyes had sunk deep into his skull, becoming black pits that seemed to absorb light. His mouth had widened into a permanent rictus grin, revealing row after row of needle-sharp teeth, and when he spoke, his voice was the sound of wind through dead leaves. "Michael," he said, and my name sounded like a curse in his mouth. "I've been waiting for you." Behind him, I could see what he'd been feeding on, the remains of other hikers, other victims who'd made the mistake of venturing too deep into this cursed place. The sight filled me with a cold fury that gave me strength. "You're not Danny," I said, raising the hatchet. The thing that wore my friend's face laughed, that same horrible sound I'd been hearing all morning. "I'm more Danny than Danny ever was. I know his memories, his fears, his secret shame about the divorce. I know how much he drank, how many nights he spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if life was worth living. I gave him purpose, Michael. I gave him hunger." It began to circle me, moving with that same predatory grace I'd witnessed the night before. "You could join him, you know. Join us. The hunger is freedom, Michael. Freedom from doubt, from pain, from the crushing weight of human existence." "Go to hell," I said, and swung the hatchet. The creature that had been Danny moved faster than anything human should be able to move, but I'd been expecting that. I let the momentum of my swing carry me around, and the blade caught it across the chest, opening a long gash that bled black ichor. It shrieked, a sound like grinding metal that made my ears ring, and lunged at me with claws extended. I managed to get the hatchet handle up in time to block most of the attack, but one claw raked across my ribs, tearing through my shirt and scoring the skin beneath. We grappled in the soft earth, and I discovered that despite its inhuman appearance, the creature was still constrained by roughly human-sized bones and joints. When I managed to get my knee into its stomach and push hard, it doubled over with a very human-sounding grunt of pain. I brought the hatchet down on its shoulder, feeling the blade bite deep into bone. The creature screamed again and rolled away from me, black blood streaming from the wound. "You can't kill what I've become," it hissed, but I could hear pain in its voice now, and something that might have been fear. "Maybe not," I said, raising the hatchet again, "but I can sure as hell try." The next few minutes were a blur of violence and pain. The creature was fast and strong, but it was also wounded and seemed to be weakening with each injury I inflicted. I managed to land several more solid hits with the hatchet, including one that nearly severed its left arm at the elbow. Finally, breathing hard and covered in both my own blood and the creature's black ichor, I stood over its broken form. It was still alive, still trying to reach for me with its remaining good arm, but its strength was fading. "Michael," it whispered, and for a moment its voice sounded almost like Danny's again. "Please, help me." I hesitated, the hatchet raised for a final blow, but then I saw the calculation in those sunken eyes, the predatory intelligence that was just waiting for me to lower my guard. I brought the hatchet down one last time. The creature died with a sound like escaping steam, its body deflating as if all the air had rushed out of it at once. Within moments, it began to decompose rapidly, skin sloughing away to reveal bones that crumbled to dust at the slightest touch. When the process was complete, there was nothing left but a pile of ordinary clothes, Danny's clothes, and a scattering of white dust that the wind quickly dispersed. I stood there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. My friend was dead, had probably been dead since the moment that thing took him the night before. I'd killed the creature that murdered him, but it felt more like putting down a rabid animal than achieving justice. The forest around me was still silent, but it felt different now. Less oppressive, less watchful, as if whatever malevolent presence had been holding this place in its grip had finally loosened its hold. I made my way back to the clearing with the ruined campsites and spent the rest of the day searching for anything that might help me find my way out. In one of the more recent debris piles, I found a GPS unit that still had battery power. It took several minutes to acquire a satellite signal. The device seemed confused by our location, as if we were somehow outside normal space, but eventually it managed to triangulate our position. According to the GPS, I was nearly 15 miles from where Danny and I had originally made camp, in an area that didn't appear on any of the topographical maps I'd studied before our trip. But more importantly, it could guide me back to the established trail system. The hike out took me 2 days. I had to stop frequently to rest and tend to my wounds, and I spent the second night huddled in the ruins of someone else's tent, listening for any sign that the forest's hungry silence was returning. But nothing disturbed me during that final night, and when I finally stumbled out of the tree line onto the familiar path of the Ho River Trail, I nearly cried with relief. The park ranger at the visitor center, the same woman who'd been reluctant to let us venture into the backcountry, took one look at my condition and immediately called for medical assistance. As the paramedics cleaned and bandaged my wounds, I tried to explain what had happened to Danny. I told them he'd fallen during the night, probably while trying to find a place to relieve himself in the dark. I said I'd searched for him for 2 days but hadn't been able to find any trace. I said I'd gotten lost myself and had been forced to bushwhack through difficult terrain to find my way back to the trail. They believed me, or at least they pretended to. Search and rescue teams went into the forest for 3 days, but they never found Danny's body. According to their report, he'd probably fallen into one of the many deep crevasses or swift-flowing streams that made the backcountry so dangerous for inexperienced hikers. I never told anyone the truth about what happened in those woods. Who would believe such a story? And more importantly, what would be the point? Danny was gone, and nothing I could say would bring him back. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about that place where the trees grow so thick that darkness feels alive. I think about the other hikers who ventured too deep and never came out. I wonder if their friends and families got the same polite explanations about falls and getting lost that I gave to Danny's ex-wife and his parents. Most of all, I think about hunger. Not the simple biological need for food, but something deeper and more terrible. The kind of hunger that can never be satisfied, that grows stronger with each feeding. The kind of hunger that wears familiar faces and speaks in trusted voices, luring the unwary deeper into darkness. I don't go camping anymore. Can't even walk through the small patch of woods behind my apartment without feeling that old, familiar dread creeping up my spine. Because I know now that there are places in this world where the normal rules don't apply, where something ancient and patient waits in the shadows between the trees. And sometimes, when the wind is just right and the night is very quiet, I swear I can still hear Danny's laughter echoing through the darkness, transformed and terrible, but unmistakably his. The hunger is still out there, waiting for the next group of friends who venture too deep into the wilderness, waiting to add their gear to that clearing of scattered campsites, waiting to wear their faces and speak their names. And someday, when enough people have forgotten the old stories and the old warnings, it will be hungry enough to venture beyond the deep woods and into the world of ordinary light. But not yet. For now, it waits. And so do I. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Hoh Rainforest, deep in the Olympic National Forest of Washington State, where the ancient trees grow so thick that daylight struggles to penetrate the canopy even at noon. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip, 4 college friends reuniting after years of scattered lives, careers, and responsibilities had pulled us in different directions. Sarah Rodriguez, my roommate from senior year, had suggested it during one of our monthly video calls. "Oh, we need this, Jen," she'd said, her pixelated face earnest on my laptop screen. "Just us, like the old days." The others had agreed enthusiastically. Michael Williams, no relation despite sharing my last name, was finishing his residency at Seattle General and desperately needed a break from the endless hospital shifts. Amy Mitchell had just gotten out of a messy divorce and wanted to reconnect with nature and herself, as she put it. And Sarah, well, Sarah had always been our group's eternal optimist, the one who believed a weekend in the woods could solve any problem. We'd chosen the Hoh River Trail specifically because Michael had hiked portions of it during medical school and promised it was beginner-friendly, but still authentic. The plan was to hike 5 miles into a backcountry campsite he'd marked on his GPS, spend 2 nights under the stars, and hike back out Sunday afternoon. Simple. Safe. Exactly what our fractured friend group needed. I should have known something was wrong when we couldn't find the trailhead. Michael's GPS kept insisting we'd arrived, but the narrow dirt road we'd followed for the last hour simply ended at a rusted gate with no Forest Service signage. The map on Sarah's phone showed nothing but blank green space. Amy's offline hiking app claimed we were somehow 3 miles northwest of where we should be. Technology, Michael had muttered, shouldering his pack with the confidence of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions. "We'll figure it out, old school." The forest that swallowed us wasn't the manicured wilderness I'd expected. This was something primordial. Sitka spruces twisted into unnatural shapes, their bark blackened with some kind of fungal growth that left dark stains on our hands when we steadied ourselves against them. The understory was choked with devil's club, their thorned stems reaching out like skeletal fingers to snag our clothes and draw thin lines of blood across our arms. But it was the silence that unsettled me most. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the undergrowth, just the whisper of our breathing and the soft squelch of our boots in the perpetually damp earth. "It's so quiet," Amy whispered during our first rest stop, unconsciously echoing my thoughts. "Probably just the season," Sarah replied, but her usual brightness seemed forced. "Animals are hunkering down for winter." Michael consulted his compass for the 10th time, frowning. "We should be hitting the river soon. I can hear water." He was right. Somewhere ahead, the sound of flowing water grew louder, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the forest itself was whispering secrets we weren't meant to hear. We found the river just as the gray afternoon light began to fade. It wasn't the clear, boulder-strewn stream from Michael's photos. This water ran dark as coffee, moving with an oily sluggishness that seemed unnatural for a mountain river. The banks were soft and yielding, our boots sinking several inches with each step. "This doesn't look right," I said, unable to keep the unease from my voice. Michael was studying his compass again, shaking it as if it had betrayed him personally. The needle's spinning. This piece of junk must be broken. "All of them are broken," Amy said quietly. She'd pulled out her phone, her hiking app, even an old orienteering compass she'd brought as backup. "Every single navigation device we have is malfunctioning." The implications hung in the air like the moisture that seemed to rise from the dark water. We were lost. Completely, utterly lost in a forest that felt increasingly alien with each passing moment. "We'll make camp here," Sarah announced with forced cheerfulness. "In the morning, we'll backtrack and find the real trail." But as we set up our tents in a small clearing beside the river, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Not by animals. There were no animals here, I was increasingly certain of that, but by something else. Something that moved just beyond the edge of vision, always in my peripheral awareness but never quite there when I turned to look. The darkness came suddenly, as if someone had thrown a switch. One moment we were finishing dinner around our small camp stove, the next we were surrounded by a blackness so complete it seemed solid. Our headlamps carved weak cones of yellow light that barely penetrated 3 feet into the pressing dark. "Jesus," Michael breathed. "I've never seen darkness like this." "The trees," Amy said, her voice tight with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. "They're blocking out the sky completely." I tilted my head back, trying to glimpse stars, moon, anything that might orient us to the normal world beyond this place. Nothing, just an oppressive canopy that seemed to press down on us like a living thing. It was then that we heard the first sound that wasn't our own breathing or the whisper of the dark river. A snapping of branches, deliberate and rhythmic, coming from somewhere across the water. "Hello," Sarah called out, her voice brave but strained. "Is someone there?" The snapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. "Probably just a deer," Michael said, but his hand had moved instinctively to the bear spray clipped to his belt. "There are no deer here," I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. "There's nothing here." Amy looked at me sharply. "What do you mean?" "Think about it. When's the last time any of us saw an animal? A bird, even an insect? This place is dead." The others exchanged glances, and I could see them mentally cataloging the day's journey. Sarah's face went pale as she realized I was right. "That's impossible," Michael said. "Forests are ecosystems. There has to be wildlife." "Then where is it?" I challenged. Before anyone could answer, the snapping resumed. Closer this time. Definitely on our side of the river. And now I could hear something else underneath it. A wet, sliding sound, like something large dragging itself through the mud. We huddled together instinctively, our 4 headlamp beams creating a pathetic sphere of light in the crushing darkness. The sounds circled our camp slowly, methodically, staying just beyond the reach of our illumination. "We should get in the tents," Amy whispered. "No," I said quickly. "Whatever's out there, we don't want to be separated." As if in response to my words, the sounds stopped. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Then Sarah screamed. Something had brushed against the back of her head, something that left long dark stains on her blonde hair when she jerked away. In the overlapping beams of our flashlights, I caught a glimpse of what might have been fingers, impossibly long and ending in ragged nails caked with mud and something darker. "Run," Michael said, his medical training finally kicking in. "Everyone stay together. Run." We crashed through the undergrowth blindly, our lights dancing wildly as we fled. Behind us, something large crashed through the trees in pursuit, moving with a speed and agility that seemed impossible for anything that size. The wet, sliding sound had become a rhythmic drumbeat, like a giant heartbeat in the darkness. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed elastic in that place, stretching and contracting in ways that made no sense. But eventually, exhaustion forced us to stop in another small clearing, this one dominated by a massive fallen tree that created a natural shelter. We pressed ourselves against the log, breathing hard, listening. Nothing. The forest had returned to its unnatural silence. "What was that thing?" Amy whispered. None of us had an answer. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, taking turns standing watch, though our lights barely penetrated the darkness enough to be useful. Twice more we heard the sliding sound, circling our hiding spot, but whatever was out there seemed content to wait. Dawn, when it finally came, was gray and weak, filtered through the thick canopy until it barely qualified as light at all. But it was enough to see that we were not where we'd made camp the night before. The river was gone. The clearing where we'd eaten dinner had vanished. We were in a completely different part of the forest, one that felt even more alien than before. "That's impossible," Michael said, staring at his GPS unit, which was now showing nothing but static. "We couldn't have run that far." "The trees," Sarah said quietly. "They're different." She was right. These spruces were enormous, their trunks easily 20 feet in diameter, their bark covered in the same dark fungal growth we'd seen before but more extensive, creating patterns that looked almost like writing in a language I didn't recognize. "We need to find our way back to the car," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This place isn't right." Amy was examining the ground around our feet. "Look at this," she said, pointing to the earth. It was soft and black, like potting soil, but it moved slightly, as if something underneath was disturbing it. "This isn't natural forest floor." Michael knelt down and pressed his hand into the dark earth. It gave way easily, and when he pulled his hand back, his palm was stained black and something small and white was embedded in the soil. A tooth. Human, by the look of it. "We're leaving. Now," I said, fighting down the panic that threatened to overwhelm me. But as we shouldered our packs and tried to orient ourselves, we realized the full extent of our predicament. Every direction looked identical: twisted trees, dark soil, and that oppressive canopy that seemed to press down on us with malevolent intent. Our compasses spun wildly. Our GPS units showed only static or impossible readings that placed us hundreds of miles from where we should be. We were not just lost. We were somewhere that shouldn't exist. "There has to be a logical explanation," Michael insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "Magnetic anomaly, underground mineral deposits, something." We chose a direction at random and began walking. The forest seemed to close in around us as we moved, the spaces between trees narrowing until we were forced to walk single file. The dark earth beneath our feet grew softer, more yielding, until each step felt like we were walking on sponges soaked with something thick and viscous. It was Sarah who noticed the patterns first. "Look at the trees," she said, stopping suddenly. "The fungus, it's not random." She was right. The dark growths on the bark weren't the chaotic spread of natural disease. They formed symbols, spirals, shapes that tugged at some primitive part of my brain and filled me with an inexplicable dread. "It's like writing," Amy whispered. "Me? Like something's trying to communicate." "With what?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. That's when we heard the laughter. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a sound like wind chimes made of broken glass, beautiful and terrible at the same time. It rose and fell in waves, sometimes seeming to come from the trees themselves, other times from beneath our feet. "Who's there?" Michael called out, his hand once again moving to his bear spray. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so complete it was like being inside a tomb. Then, slowly, we heard footsteps. Not the heavy crash of whatever had pursued us the night before, but light, almost delicate steps coming toward us through the trees. A figure emerged from the shadows between the spruces, and my heart nearly stopped. It was Sarah. Not our Sarah, who was standing right beside me, but another Sarah. Identical in every way except for the smile. This other Sarah smiled too wide, the expression stretching her features in ways that human faces weren't meant to move. Her eyes were black from corner to corner, reflecting our lights like pools of oil. "Hello, friends," the thing that looked like Sarah said, its voice exactly right and completely wrong at the same time. "I've been waiting for you." Beside me, the real Sarah made a small broken sound like a sob caught in her throat. "You're not real," Michael said, but his voice shook. The false Sarah tilted her head at an impossible angle, the movement too fluid, too controlled. "Aren't I? How can you be sure? Maybe I'm the real one and she's the copy." It gestured toward our Sarah with one pale hand, and I noticed that its fingernails were black and appeared to be growing even as I watched. "Prove it," the thing said, still smiling that horrible smile. "Prove which one of us belongs here." "You're lying," I said, stepping protectively in front of my friend. The false Sarah laughed again, that wind chime sound that made my teeth ache. "Am I? This is my forest, my domain. You've been walking in circles for hours, did you know that? Round and round. Deeper and deeper, until you've crossed into a place where the old rules don't apply." It was then that I noticed the trees around us were moving, their massive trunks shifting position with glacial slowness, rearranging themselves like chess pieces on some vast board. "What do you want?" Amy asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What I've always wanted," the thing replied. "To feed, to grow, to take what doesn't belong to me and make it mine." Its black eyes fixed on each of us in turn. "One of you will stay. One of you will join me. The others—" It shrugged with Sarah's shoulders. "The others will find their way home, eventually. Changed, perhaps, but alive." "No," Sarah said, finding her voice at last. "Nobody's staying. We're leaving." The false Sarah's smile widened until it split her face like a wound. "Oh, my dear copy. You misunderstand. The choice has already been made." That's when Amy screamed. I spun around to see her backing away from something behind us, her face white with terror. Where she'd been standing moments before, the dark earth was bubbling and heaving, and skeletal hands were pushing through the soil like obscene flowers blooming in fast forward. "The forest is hungry," the false Sarah said conversationally. "It's been so long since anyone wandered this deep. So long, since there was fresh meat to corrupt and transform." The skeletal hands were followed by arms, shoulders, heads. Figures pulled themselves from the earth, their movements jerky and unnatural. They might have been human once, but whatever they were now had been changed by this place into something else entirely. Their skin was the gray-black of old mushrooms, their eyes empty sockets that seemed to drink in light. "Choose," the false Sarah said, and now its voice carried harmonics that hurt to hear, frequencies that bypassed the ears and struck directly at the primitive fear centers of the brain. "Choose who stays, or I'll take you all." Michael raised the bear spray, but before he could use it, one of the earthborn things was on him. It moved with impossible speed, covering 20 feet in what seemed like a single bound. The spray hissed uselessly as skeletal fingers wrapped around his throat. I heard him choking, saw his face turning purple, and acted without thinking. I grabbed a fallen branch and swung it at the creature with all my strength. The impact jarred my arms and sent pain shooting up to my shoulders, but the thing released Michael and turned its attention to me. Up close, I could see that it had once been human. The bone structure was right, the proportions correct, but something had hollowed it out and filled the empty spaces with corruption. When it opened its mouth, I could see down its throat to where something writhed in the darkness of its chest cavity. "Run!" I gasped to the others, and this time they didn't argue. We scattered in different directions, crashing through the undergrowth as the things that had emerged from the earth pursued us. I could hear Amy screaming somewhere to my left, Michael cursing as he fought off another attacker to my right. The false Sarah's laughter followed us, seeming to come from the trees themselves. I don't know how long I ran before I realized I was alone. The forest had gone silent again, and when I stopped to catch my breath, I could no longer hear the others. My headlamp had been torn away in my flight, and the weak gray light filtering through the canopy was barely enough to see by. "Sarah!" I called out. "Michael! Amy!" Nothing. I tried retracing my steps, but in this place directions had no meaning. Every tree looked the same, every path led deeper into the maze of twisted wood and corrupted earth. The symbols carved into the bark seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them, rearranging themselves into new configurations that hurt to decipher. I walked for what felt like hours, calling out occasionally but receiving no response. The silence was absolute, pressing against my eardrums like physical weight. Even my own footsteps seemed muffled, as if the forest was absorbing all sound. It was nearly dark again when I found the campsite. Not our campsite. This one was older, much older. 3 tents arranged in a triangle around the cold remains of a fire. 2 of the tents had been shredded from the inside, their nylon walls hanging in tatters. The third was intact but stood open, revealing sleeping bags that looked like they'd been slept in recently. On closer inspection, the sleeping bags were unzipped from the inside. I approached the fire ring cautiously, noting the scattered remains of a meal. Canned food, mostly empty but still relatively fresh. Someone had been here recently. Someone might still be here. "Hello?" I called softly. A rustling from the intact tent made me freeze. Something was moving inside, something large enough to make the entire structure sway. "Is someone there?" I said, louder this time. The rustling stopped. Then, slowly, a figure emerged from the tent. It was Amy. But, like the false Sarah, this Amy was wrong in ways that were immediately apparent but difficult to articulate. She moved too smoothly, with none of the jerky, nervous energy that characterized my friend. Her smile was perfect and empty, painted on like a doll's. "Jennifer," she said, and her voice was exactly right, except for the fact that it echoed strangely, as if coming from the bottom of a deep well. "I've been waiting for you." "Where are the others?" I asked, backing away slowly. "Safe," the false Amy said. "Changing. Becoming something better than they were before." She took a step toward me, and I could see that her feet weren't quite touching the ground. She hovered an inch or 2 above the dark earth, her movement creating small eddies in the corrupt soil. "You can join them," she continued. "You can be part of this place, part of its hunger. It's beautiful, Jennifer. Its purpose." "Where's the real Amy?" I demanded. The thing that looked like my friend tilted its head. "I am Amy. More Amy than she ever was. I have her memories, her feelings, her fears. I know that she was afraid of being alone after her divorce. I know she came on this trip hoping to reconnect with friendships that had grown stale over the years. I know she secretly resented Sarah for her eternal optimism and Michael for his calm competence under pressure." Each word hit like a physical blow because they were true. These were things the real Amy had confided to me in quiet moments, private fears and resentments she'd never shared with the others. "But I also know things she never did," the false Amy continued. "I know how the forest thinks. I know what it wants. I know that everything dies eventually, and it's better to die with purpose than to waste away in some sterile hospital bed or retirement home." She was close enough now that I could smell her, or rather, smell the absence where her scent should be. Instead of Amy's familiar perfume and shampoo, there was only the rich, loamy odor of decomposition. "The others agreed," she said. "Eventually. They all saw the wisdom of joining us, of becoming more than they were." "Liar," I whispered. She smiled that perfect, empty smile. "Am I? Michael is just over there. Would you like to see him?" Before I could respond, she gestured toward the tree line and another figure emerged from between the massive spruces. This one was Michael, But like the false Amy, he was wrong in fundamental ways. His lab coat, where had he gotten a lab coat in the forest, was spotless white despite the corrupt environment, and his movements had the same unnatural smoothness. "Jennifer," he said, his voice carrying the same hollow echo, "you're just in time for the procedure." In his hands was a syringe filled with something dark and viscous that seemed to move on its own within the glass chamber. "What procedure?" I asked, though I was already backing away. "The one that will make you like us," he said. "The one that will help you understand what this place really is, what it's always been." "A feeding ground," the false Amy added. "A place where the old things sleep and dream and occasionally wake to feast on whatever stumbles into their domain." The false Michael nodded. "We tried to resist at first. But the hunger is so beautiful, Jennifer. So pure. Once you understand it, once you become part of it, you'll wonder why you ever wanted to be human." They began moving toward me in perfect synchronization, their feet still not quite touching the ground. I turned and ran, crashing through the undergrowth as panic took hold. Behind me, I could hear them laughing, not the wind chime sound of the false Sarah, but something deeper, more fundamentally wrong. It was the sound of the earth itself being amused by my futile attempt to escape. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, then stumbled forward on hands and knees, driven by pure terror. The forest around me grew denser, the trees larger and more twisted. The symbols carved into their bark were glowing now with a faint phosphorescence that hurt to look at directly. When I finally collapsed, unable to go any further, I found myself in yet another clearing. But this one was different from the others. Older. The trees here were ancient beyond comprehension, their trunks so massive that they seemed more like geographical features than living things. And in the center of the clearing was a structure. It might have been an altar once, carved from some dark stone that reflected no light. It was roughly circular, about 12 feet in diameter, and covered with symbols that made the ones on the trees seem like children's drawings by comparison. These were complex geometric patterns that seemed to exist in more dimensions than my eyes could process, creating an optical illusion that made my head pound and my vision blur. Around the altar, arranged in perfect circles, were bones. Human bones, picked clean and bleached white, skulls, rib cages, femurs, thousands of them, representing more people than could have gone missing in this area without someone noticing. Unless, of course, the area had been claiming victims for much longer than anyone realized. As I stared at the bone field, trying to process what I was seeing, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate, and definitely touching the ground this time. I turned to see Sarah approaching. The real Sarah, I was almost certain. She moved with her characteristic quick, nervous energy, and her clothes were torn and dirty from our flight through the forest. But her eyes were black from corner to corner. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said, and her voice was her own but with something else speaking underneath it, like a second voice layered just beneath the first. All those people who found their way here over the centuries, all of them part of it now, part of the hunger. "Sarah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "fight it. Whatever it's doing to you, fight it." She laughed, and it was almost her normal laugh except for the harmonic underneath that made my bones ache. "Fight what? This is freedom, Jen. This is purpose. Do you know what I was before I came here? A middle manager at a marketing firm, pushing meaningless products to people who didn't need them. Lonely, desperate for connection, afraid that my best years were behind me." She gestured to the bone field around us. "But now I'm part of something eternal. Something that was old when the first humans walked this continent. Something that will be here long after the last cities crumble." "That's not you talking," I said. "That's whatever's infected this place." "Is it?" she asked, tilting her head. "Or is it just the part of me that I never had the courage to acknowledge? The part that knew life was meaningless unless you could make it mean something?" She was moving closer now, and I could see that her fingernails had grown longer, darker, ending in points that looked sharp enough to cut. The others understood eventually, she continued. Amy was the easiest. She was so hungry for belonging that she practically threw herself into the transformation. Michael fought longer, but his scientific mind couldn't resist the evidence once he saw what we could become. "Where are they, really?" I demanded. Sarah smiled, and for a moment she looked like herself again. "They're here. They'll always be here. Part of the forest, part of the hunger, part of something larger than their small human lives ever could have been." She gestured to the bone field again, and I realized with mounting horror that some of the skulls were too fresh, too new, that the clothes scattered among the remains included fragments I recognized. A piece of Amy's hiking boot, a strip of fabric from Michael's jacket. "You killed them," I whispered. "I freed them," Sarah corrected. "From the prison of flesh, from the burden of meaningless existence. And now I can free you too." She lunged at me with impossible speed, her transformed nails slashing toward my throat. I threw myself sideways, rolling across the dark earth and feeling the corruption seep through my clothes to touch my skin. Where it made contact, I felt a burning sensation followed by a strange numbness, as if something was trying to take root. Sarah landed where I'd been standing and turned to face me, her black eyes reflecting the weak light filtering through the canopy. "You can't run forever, Jennifer. This is my domain now. The forest listens to me. The earth obeys me." As if to prove her point, the ground beneath my feet began to heave and bubble. I scrambled away just as skeletal hands erupted from the soil, grasping for my ankles. "Join us," the things emerging from the earth whispered in unison. "Join us, join us, join us." I recognized voices among the chorus, Amy's laugh, Michael's stern intonation, others I couldn't place but that carried the echo of familiar humanity. "Fight it!" I screamed at Sarah, desperation making my voice crack. "This isn't what you wanted. This isn't who you are." For just a moment, something flickered in her black eyes. A hint of the friend I'd known, the woman who'd called me every month to maintain our connection across the years and miles. "Jen," she said, and her voice was purely her own. I can't stop it. It's in my head, in my blood. It's changing me from the inside out." The moment of clarity passed, and the thing wearing Sarah's face reasserted control. "But I don't want to stop it," she said, her voice layering with harmonics again. "This is evolution. This is becoming something more than human." She lunged again, but this time I was ready. I grabbed a piece of the ancient altar, a fragment of stone that had broken off over the eons, and swung it with all my remaining strength. It connected with her skull with a sound like breaking pottery. Sarah staggered backward, black fluid leaking from the wound, but she didn't fall. Instead, she laughed. "You can't kill what's already dead," she said. "You can't destroy what's become part of the eternal hunger." But I noticed that the skeletal hands reaching from the earth had stopped moving. The whispers had faded to silence. Whatever connection she had to this place, I'd disrupted it, if only temporarily. I ran through the bone field, kicking skulls aside as I fled toward the tree line. Behind me, Sarah's laughter followed, growing louder and more distorted until it seemed to come from the trees themselves. I crashed through the undergrowth, no longer caring about direction or navigation. All that mattered was putting distance between myself and the altar, between myself and whatever Sarah had become. The forest fought me at every step. Branches reached out to snag my clothes and tear my skin. Roots erupted from the ground to trip me. The very air seemed to thicken, making each breath a struggle. But eventually, impossibly, I saw light ahead. Not the gray, half-light filtered through the canopy, but genuine sunlight streaming between normal-looking trees. I stumbled toward it, hardly daring to believe what I was seeing. The twisted spruces were giving way to ordinary Douglas firs. The corrupt soil was becoming normal forest floor covered with fallen needles and decomposing leaves. The oppressive silence was broken by the sound of birds calling in the distance. I emerged from the tree line onto a paved road, blinking in actual sunlight for the first time in what felt like days, but had probably been less than 36 hours. A green Forest Service sign read, "Ho River Trail, 3 miles," with an arrow pointing down the road. A pickup truck was approaching, and I waved frantically until it stopped. The driver was a park ranger, an older man with kind eyes and a face weathered by years of outdoor work. "Miss, are you all right?" he asked, getting out of his truck. "You look like you've been through hell." I tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out as a jumbled mess of incomplete sentences and half-formed terrors. How do you tell someone that your friends were consumed by a forest that shouldn't exist? How do you describe watching people you love transform into something hungry and alien? The ranger listened patiently, then called for backup on his radio. Within an hour, the area was swarming with search and rescue teams, their dogs straining against leashes as they tried to follow my scent back into the forest. But they found nothing. No campsite, no bone field, no ancient altar or trees covered in glowing symbols. According to their GPS units and topographical maps, the area I described didn't exist. The forest I'd emerged from was a thin strip of woods barely a quarter-mile deep, bordered on all sides by logged areas and access roads. The search continued for 3 days. The FBI got involved when the local authorities couldn't explain how 3 people could vanish so completely from such a small area. Search dogs found no trace of Sarah, Michael, or Amy. Helicopters with thermal imaging detected no signs of life in the surrounding forest. It was as if they had never existed. The official report concluded that I'd suffered some kind of psychological break brought on by altitude sickness and dehydration. The trauma of watching my friends die in an accident I couldn't remember had caused me to construct an elaborate fantasy to cope with survivor's guilt. They prescribed therapy and anti-anxiety medication. They suggested I take some time off work to process what had happened. They were very kind and very thorough and completely wrong about everything. But I let them believe their version of events because the alternative was worse. The alternative was accepting that places like the one I'd escaped still existed in the world, pockets of primordial hunger that had never been tamed or civilized or mapped. That was 6 months ago. I've been back to therapy, back to work, back to what everyone assures me is a normal life. But I can't stop thinking about what Sarah said in that final moment of clarity, when the thing wearing her face allowed her to speak with her own voice. It's in my head, in my blood. It's changing me from the inside out. Because lately, I've been having dreams about the forest. Dreams where I walk between twisted trees under a canopy so thick that no light can penetrate. Dreams where I hear familiar voices calling my name from the darkness between the spruces. And sometimes when I wake up, my fingernails are longer than they were when I went to sleep. Sometimes I catch myself humming a melody that sounds like wind chimes made of broken glass. Sometimes I look in the mirror and my reflection seems to flicker, showing something with black eyes and 2 wide smiles standing behind my shoulder. The doctors say it's post-traumatic stress. They say the mind plays tricks when it's trying to process unresolvable trauma. They increase my medication and schedule more sessions and assure me that with time these symptoms will fade. But I know better. I know that some hungers are patient. Some infections take time to fully take hold. Some transformations happen slowly, gradually, so subtly that you don't realize what's happening until it's far too late to stop it. And I know that somewhere in a forest that shouldn't exist, 3 people who used to be my friends are waiting for me to join them. Waiting for the day when whatever seeds were planted in that corrupt soil finally sprout and bloom. I can feel them growing inside me, taking root in my bloodstream, sending tentative shoots through my nervous system. Each day, I fight them. Each day, I become a little less human and a little more something else. The hunger is beautiful, they whisper in my dreams. The hunger is pure. And sometimes, in the small hours of the morning when my defenses are weakest, I find myself agreeing with them. Soon, I think, I'll stop fighting altogether. Soon, I'll find my way back to that impossible forest where my friends are waiting, Soon, I'll understand what Sarah meant when she said this was evolution. But not yet. Not today. Today, I'm still human enough to be afraid of what I'm becoming. Still human enough to write this account as a warning to anyone who might read it. Stay on the marked trails. Trust your instruments when they tell you you're going the wrong way. And if you ever find yourself in a forest where nothing lives and the trees are covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, run. Run fast and far, and don't look back. Because the hunger is patient, and it's always looking for new recruits. And once it finds you, it never lets you go.